Hey everyone, nearly 97% of people who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It means a lot. Also, be sure to give the video a like and drop a comment below. Your interaction helps more people discover the channel and supports its growth. Thanks a ton for being here. By the way, I'd love to know, which country or city are you watching from? I was working in a part of Pennsylvania I knew well enough to move through without thinking, but that didn't mean it felt friendly. Wetland work always put me in strange corners of the woods, places where no one had walked for years, places that still held pieces of the old land before the state took it over. That day I was tracing a series of seeps and springs that fed an old farm reservoir sitting at the edge of a valley. The restoration crew wanted a better map of what fed into it, and it was my job to walk up the hill, follow the water, and mark every spot where it surfaced. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles on your shoulders and makes you hear your own breathing louder. The ground was soft from the steady flow of cold water. My boots were heavy with mud by the time I got halfway up the slope. I kept my head down, watching the little streams turn into thin ribbons that disappeared under moss and dead leaves. Every few minutes I stopped, took a waypoint, wrote notes, and kept climbing. The woods had that old farm feel. Broken stone walls, iron fence posts half eaten by rust, a few apple trees twisted into strange shapes. It didn't surprise me when I came over a low rise and saw a small clearing with junk scattered all across it. At first it looked like a hunting camp someone abandoned years ago, but then I noticed the kind of trash people leave when they don't expect anyone to find it. Rusted out chairs with their stuffing spilling out, a refrigerator lying on its back with its door open like a mouth, piles of tuna cans, old chewing tobacco tins, crushed natty cans faded by rain and sun. Someone had been living there long enough to wear a path through the leaves, but it wasn't recent. Everything was weathered and sunk into the dirt. Stuff like that isn't unusual on old public land that used to be private. People set up hideouts, or drifters pass through and camp out for a season and leave their things behind. I didn't like being around it, but I also didn't feel threatened by it. I was about to mark it on my notes and turn back toward the springs when I heard movement behind me. I turned, ready to see a person stepping out of the brush, but instead there was a large German shepherd standing 10 feet away, staring at me. The dog was clean, really clean, not wild at all. Coat brushed, healthy weight, bright eyes. That was somehow worse than if it had been a feral animal. A dog like that meant someone was nearby, someone capable enough to keep in good shape, and someone who might not appreciate a stranger poking around their old camp. My first thought was simple and clear. Great, now I'm screwed. I slid my hand up the handle of my shovel and tightened my grip. I didn't want to fight a dog, but I also didn't want to stand there and let it charge me. The dog didn't growl. It didn't move toward me. It just turned around, looked back at me, and took a few steps uphill, almost like it was checking to see if I'd follow. It did it again, looking at me, stepping forward and stopping. I didn't know what to make of that. A friendly dog in the middle of the woods near an abandoned camp felt wrong, but it was too clean to be out there alone. The only thing I could think was that maybe someone was hurt or sick up the hill and the dog was trying to get help. I followed at a distance, shovel still in my hand. The dog moved with a steady pace, not rushing, not stopping. We passed behind the camp, climbing higher up the ridge. The trees thinned for a moment before they closed in again, and the ground flattened out into a strange little pocket of space that didn't look natural at all. That was when I saw them. 20 to 30 old dolls were buried up to their necks in the ground, forming a rough circle. Their faces were sun-bleached and cracked, their hair matted, their fabric bodies torn where the dirt met their necks. Their arms were pointed upward, stiff and crooked, like they were reaching for something or warning about something. I stood there staring, trying to understand what I was looking at, trying to make sense of it in some normal way. But there was no normal explanation for it. Someone had spent time and effort setting them all like that. Then I noticed the smell. Sweet, rotten, heavy. I followed it with my eyes until I saw the deer carcass hanging from a rope looped over a low branch of a tree above the dolls. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't old either. The body was gutted and strung up in a careful way, not the way hunters process deer. This was something else entirely, something that made my stomach twist. The whole scene felt wrong in a deep, human way, like walking into someone's private ritual. The dog sat down next to me and stared up at the carcass, completely calm, like it had brought me here on purpose. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. I kept thinking about my wedding coming up in a month. I kept thinking about how far away my truck was. I kept thinking about how no one knew I was up there except my supervisor, who wouldn't expect to hear from me until the end of the day. None of that gave me any comfort. It just made the whole thing feel heavier. I didn't say anything. I didn't shout. I didn't take photos. I didn't take notes. I turned around and walked the same way I came, slow at first, then faster once I got past the old camp. I didn't stop until I reached the reservoir. I didn't look back to see if the dog was following. I didn't want to know. When I finally reached my truck, I sat inside with the doors locked for a full 5 minutes before I even turned the key. I felt like the woods were holding their breath around me. I drove back to the office, handed in my notes, and didn't mention a single thing about what I'd seen. The job was done. The map was complete. That was all anyone needed to know. I never went back. I never will. Whatever was on that hill had nothing to do with my work and nothing to do with wetlands. It belonged to someone who didn't want strangers there, someone who spent time arranging things that had no normal reason to exist. I didn't want to learn what the point of it was. I had a family to start and a life to live, and I wasn't going to risk either by going back to a place that felt like it was waiting for the wrong kind of person to find it. Some places in the woods stay with you even when you try to forget them. That hill is one of them, and I'm fine leaving it that way. When I think back to that camping spot between the two ponds, I can still picture the way the air felt that first night. I was 13, old enough to carry my own pack and act like I knew what I was doing, but still young enough to get excited every time we found a new place in that national park. My family had a habit of driving far down old logging roads to avoid the busy campgrounds. Those roads were rough and narrow, and most people didn't want to deal with the rocks, dips, and thick weeds. But that privacy was the whole point for us. We liked the feeling of having the forest to ourselves, like we were stepping out of our regular lives and into a place where time slowed down. That year, we found the spot between the two ponds. The road narrowed so much at the end that our old vehicle couldn't push through. So we parked where the weeds were waist high and carried our gear the rest of the way. I remember how the weeds brushed against my legs and how the ground rose and dipped with old tree roots and mounds of dirt. When we stepped onto that small hill wedge between the ponds, it felt like we'd discovered a place no one else knew about. One pond stretched out to the left, dark and still, but filled with the constant chirping of frogs under the last bit of daylight. The other pond sat to the right, with patches of reeds that shook whenever something small moved inside them. The whole area felt alive. We set up our tents on the flattest part of the hill. The air cooled down fast once the sun vanished. The frogs got louder, almost rhythmic, and the sound washed over everything. I lay in my sleeping bag that night, listening to them like they were some kind of natural soundtrack. I didn't realize how much comfort that sound was giving me until the moment it stopped. Around 2 a.m, I woke up without knowing why. At first I thought it was just the cold because the night air had that sharp, wet feeling that makes you curl into yourself. Then I heard engines, low and heavy, coming from the road we'd walked in on. I didn't understand how anything that big was pushing through that overgrowth. But the engines kept getting closer, deeper, louder, until the sound filled the whole space between the ponds. 2 massive black trucks rolled in like they belonged there. Their tires barely slowed down for the uneven ground. They stopped at the bottom of the hill, close to the edge of the ponds. The headlights stayed off, which made the whole scene feel wrong before anything even happened. The frogs were still chirping at that point, but their voices wavered like they sensed something changing. Men started climbing out of the trucks. More men than those trucks should have been able to hold. They moved with this strange, silent coordination like they had done this exact thing 100 times before. I expected flashlights, noise, something normal, but they brought nothing. No voices, no beam of light cutting through the air. Just nets. Long, thin nets that swung gently at their sides as they walked straight into the water. Watching grown men wade into ponds in complete silence at 2 in the morning felt like something my brain wasn't built to make sense of. They didn't hesitate as the water climbed up their legs. They just spread out and dragged their nets through the ponds in long, practiced sweeps. Every movement seemed thought out. Every few minutes they turned and dumped frogs into the beds of the trucks. The only sound came from the water splashing around them. It went on for over an hour. The frogs got quieter and quieter until the only noise left was the faint sloshing of water. When they finished, they climbed back into the trucks just as silently as they had arrived. No talking, no hesitation, no sign that they had even noticed us. The trucks growled back up the hill and vanished into the darkness. When the sound of the engines finally faded, the silence felt like pressure. The ponds were completely still. Not a single croak, not a single rustle from the reeds. It was as if the entire place had been emptied of life in one night. The next morning we walked around the edges of the ponds. Around a muddy shallows, we found one injured frog, its leg bent at an odd angle. We picked it up carefully and placed it back in the water, hoping it would recover. But even with that small survivor, the pond stayed dead quiet. The whole trip felt different after that. The place, which had felt peaceful and wild when we arrived, suddenly felt watched and hollow. I kept glancing at the trail, half expecting the trucks to come back again. But nothing else happened. Not that year, not the next. Even when we camped there again years later, we never saw those men or their trucks again. The following summer we camped in a different spot in the same park, not wanting a repeat of that night. That trip had its own strange moment, but in a way that felt almost normal compared to the silent frog raid. Sometime before dawn, I woke up to a scraping sound outside the tent. The first thing I smelled was that musky odor that only comes from a black bear. When I crawled out of the tent, I saw a bear walking away with our cooler in its jaws like it was carrying a briefcase. It didn't even look bothered by the weight. The cooler bumped against its legs, and the bear just kept going. By the time the sun came up, we found the cooler down in a patch of flattened grass. The marshmallows were gone, a few beer cans were crushed, and everything else was scattered. It was annoying, but easy to understand. A bear is a bear. It does bear things. But those trucks and those men had stayed in my head long after the bear incident stopped feeling important. I never figured out why they wanted the frogs or why they moved like they didn't care who saw them. The older I get, the more I realize that the scariest things in the woods are usually the things done by people who don't care if you understand them or not. That night between the ponds taught me something I still think about every time I go camping. Animals will take food, weather will change plans, accidents will happen, but the things people do in the dark for their own reasons can change the way a place feels forever. And for me, those 2 ponds never felt the same again. I never understood how fast a normal day could turn into something that felt like the end of the world until that summer when the fire came down from the mountains. I live between 2 national forests, and every year there are warnings, smoke days, small flare-ups, and the usual reminders to keep a bag ready. But that year was different. The heat had been building since late spring. Everything around us felt dry and brittle, and people kept saying it was only a matter of time. When the fire actually came, it felt like the air itself changed. It felt like the sky became heavier and the ground became lighter at the same time, like the whole environment was preparing to move. That day I came home from work feeling tired, but also uneasy. My dad had just gotten home too. We tried to pretend everything was normal, but something in the air made it impossible to relax. I kept stepping outside, squinting at the horizon, trying to convince myself the orange glow I saw was nothing more than late sunlight, or maybe someone burning brush illegally. But it kept growing brighter in a way sunlight never could. When I finally realized the mountain was actually burning, the fear hit me all at once. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you run or scream. It was the quiet kind that sits on your chest and doesn't let you breathe right. The first thing I did was go straight for our legal documents. I moved on instinct. Birth certificates, medical files, anything that would matter if everything else turned to ash. It took me half an hour to get it all together, even though I was moving fast. I kept dropping things because my hand was shaking. I tried not to think about what it meant that I was packing every document that proved we existed. I stuffed everything in a bag and pushed it near the door, and when I straightened up, the room felt hotter than it should have been. I didn't know if it was because of the fire outside or the stress inside my body. Then came my younger sister. She was only 8 then, and panic hit her in waves. She loved her stuffed animals more than anything, and she kept grabbing armfuls of them. Seeing her so scared made my own fear sharper. It's a terrible thing to have to look at a child and tell them they can't save everything they love. I kept reminding myself that it was better she cried now rather than cried later about losing all of them. She kept sobbing and pressing toys against her chest like she could protect them with her body. Eventually, she chose a few favorites, including that elephant she got when she was 4 from an ambulance. I knew how much that one meant to her. I packed most of her things for her because she was too overwhelmed to think straight. The whole time, I tried to keep my hands steady, even though inside, I felt like I was shaking apart. When I checked on my older sister, she was strangely calm. She packed a small bag and said she was done. She always did that, shut down her emotions until everything was over. I envied her for that. My own mind was racing the entire time, thinking of every scenario, imagining the fire rolling down toward us like a wave of heat and noise. My parents told me to go pack my own things next. That's when the panic I had been pushing away finally got to me. I grabbed some expensive things like my purse collection, but then I paused and wondered if any of that would matter if the house burned down. Still, I packed them. I packed artwork I had worked on for years. I packed things that felt like pieces of myself. I kept finding more things that seemed important until I realized I was overheating. I was standing in the top floor of the house in the peak of summer, breathing air that felt thick. My heart was beating too fast, and my skin felt hot. I sat down on the floor and tried to calm myself before I passed out. For a minute or two, I thought I might actually faint. After that, I moved on to the animals. At that time, we had 12 hens, 2 guinea pigs, and 2 dogs. The hens were clucking nervously like they knew something was wrong. Animals always know. We packed food, water, bedding, hay leashes, harnesses, everything we could grab. It felt unreal to be preparing to run from a fire with practically half a barn in tow. The guinea pigs went into their transport cage, and I placed them by the door so they'd be ready. Their tiny bodies trembled in that way guinea pigs do, like they were vibrating from the inside. I wished I could explain to them why everything looked so frantic. My dad brought home a trailer his boss let him borrow. That trailer ended up being the only reason we could pack as much as we did. I wasn't allowed to carry anything heavy outside because of my asthma. The smoke was growing thicker by the minute, even inside the house. One deep breath of it would have landed me in the ER. So I packed smaller things and tried not to think about how helpless that made me feel. I hated standing by the door listening to everyone else hauling boxes and crates while I waited inside, trying not to trigger an attack. But then the fire was halfway down the mountain. When I stepped outside for a moment, the heat from it felt like a blast from an oven. The whole sky had turned into a mix of purple smoke and glaring orange light. Ash drifted down in little pieces, almost like it was snowing, but the snow had been burned black. Every breath of outside air hurt. I went back in and stayed there. It took hours to get everything out, and by the time we finished, night had fallen. The fire had reached the base of the mountain on one side, and the glow lit up the entire night sky like a second sunset that refused to fade. We were all exhausted. I remember looking at my parents, expecting them to say it was time to go, but they kept saying not yet. They were trying to stay calm, trying to avoid panic, but I could see fear hiding behind their eyes. The kind of fear parents never want their kids to see. Somehow my sisters and I fell asleep by the front door. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the heat, maybe it was something else. I remember lying there, staring at the orange light flickering through the window. The fire made the world look unreal. The flames were so tall they almost reached the sky, and the smoke swirled like dark waves. It was terrifying, but in a strange way it was also beautiful. The kind of beauty you feel guilty for noticing. It felt like watching a painting made of destruction. I kept waking up through the night. Each time I opened my eyes, the flames seemed a little smaller. Then I would fall asleep again, thinking maybe I was dreaming. At one point, long before dawn, I opened my eyes, and the orange glow looked softer, like someone had turned down a giant dimmer switch. I didn't know it then, but while we were sleeping, fire crews from multiple departments had come in and created a fire line. They fought all night in smoke and heat I can't even imagine. They held that line through the worst part of the fire. When I woke up for good at around 6 in the morning, the world was quiet in a way it hadn't been for hours. The mountain was still burning, but the 1,000-foot flames were gone. The sky was gray and heavy with smoke, but the immediate danger had passed. I shook everyone awake, and we all understood at the same time. Relief hit like a wave. My parents hugged us. A few of us were crying. We knew how close it had been. Later we found out a firefighter had been badly burned fighting the line that saved our neighborhood. He survived, thank God, and started therapy afterward. A bucket helicopter had crashed the night before too, and somehow everyone lived through that as well. Only one house and a few government buildings were lost. Considering how massive the fire was, 35,000 acres, it was a miracle the damage wasn't worse. I think what burned us emotionally wasn't just the fire that night, but everything the fire brought back. Years earlier, we had survived a house fire. We knew the smell of burning belongings. We knew the feeling of running out with nothing. Losing Lady back then had been painful in a way that still stung. Later losing Thunder to an accident and losing Rex to the heat and stress from this same fire added more weight to everything we felt that night. Grief has a way of stacking itself until every new loss feels bigger. When the fire was finally under control, when the trucks left and the sky turned back to normal, all I kept thinking about was how close we came to losing everything again. But we didn't. We packed, we prepared, we stayed awake through a night that didn't feel real, and in the end we were still standing. We had our home, our family, our animals, and even though not everyone we loved was still with us, we got through it with more than we expected. The fear never fully leaves, and the memory of that sky, glowing orange, still shows up when I think about it too long. But the ending is clear and simple. We survived. Our home survived. And now, whenever I look at the mountains, I don't just see trees and slopes. I see the night the fire almost reached us and the line of people who stopped it. I have been hiking for 3 days straight through the backcountry, following a stretch of trail that few people ever touched. The kind of trail that swallows you up, where the forest closes in so tightly that the sunlight barely makes it through the canopy, and the quiet is so absolute you can hear your own heartbeat and the distant snap of a twig under a squirrel's foot. I had left my car at the trailhead early the morning before, and by the time I reached that section, I hadn't passed another person since the first few miles. It was liberating in a way, the kind of freedom that comes from being utterly alone, but it also carried a subtle, nagging unease that you only feel when you are aware of how exposed you are. I couldn't put my finger on a single event that sparked the feeling. It was more like a constant hum at the back of my mind, a combination of isolation and awareness. You see, hikers get used to being around people, even if they're strangers, even if it's just for a minute at a junction or a campsite. When that contact vanishes, you start to notice things differently. Shadows take on weight. The rustle of leaves makes you tense, and every snap of a branch sets your brain racing. And that's when I saw him. He was just coming down the trail from the opposite direction. I didn't notice him at first because I was staring at the roots snaking across the path, but then I looked up and caught a glimpse of movement. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a dark jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. He wasn't doing anything unusual at first glance, just walking, but there was something about the way he carried himself, the rhythm of his steps, that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't fear exactly, more like an instinctive awareness that I couldn't ignore. In the city, you see a stranger and nothing happens. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, you're aware that legality, morality, and even common decency carry far less weight than you're used to. An axe murderer could exist, relying on the fact that nobody would intervene because they were so isolated. That thought made my pulse quicken. I kept my gaze forward, but tried to get a sense of his pace. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't change course, didn't even seem to notice I was there. That in itself felt strange. Most people on trails glance at others, nod, say a word. He looked like he belonged in another world, or like he was purposefully avoiding interacting with the world entirely. I kept walking, trying to put as much distance between us as possible without showing overt concern. My backpack felt heavier than usual, every strap digging into my shoulders, every ounce of weight a reminder that I was fully loaded and fully exposed. I thought about turning onto a side trail, even though it would add miles to my hike, just to give myself some peace of mind. But something told me to hold my course, to keep going and watch him from a distance. As I walked, my mind began cataloging the things I noticed about him. The hat was worn, the jacket weathered and stained, the boots thick with mud. He carried a large pack, but not like a normal hiker's pack. It seemed overstuffed, lumpy, uneven. His gait didn't suggest fatigue or casual hiking. It was deliberate, almost methodical, like he was following a plan I couldn't see. All the small, reasonable things hikers do. Singing to themselves to avoid startling bears, tapping poles on the ground, adjusting packs, brushing away sweat, looked completely different when viewed through the lens of someone who was already on edge. My city senses, as I call them, were screaming. This is unusual. Dangerous maybe, maybe not, but definitely not normal. I try to rationalize it. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was a long-term backcountry hiker. Maybe he was friendly and I was just jumpy. But still, the way he moved, the fact that I hadn't seen another person all morning, all of it set my instincts on fire. Hours passed, though it could have been minutes. The trail twisted, climbed, and dropped through dense forest and rocky outcrops. I kept him in my peripheral vision, though he seemed unaware I existed. I kept imagining the worst-case scenarios, trying to outthink them, trying to prepare for an encounter. I imagined reaching for my bear spray or a knife if it came down to it, but I also knew that most of the fear was my mind playing tricks on me in isolation. There's a mental strain to being alone for so long. It's 2 p.m. I hadn't spoken to a single human all day, and the combination of hunger, fatigue, and social deprivation makes every rustle of leaves feel like a threat. Eventually, the trail widened into a meadow. Sunlight poured in, warming my shoulders and reminding me that the world wasn't entirely dark. I looked around and noticed a man had paused near a copse of trees, as if he'd been watching me too. My pulse jumped, but as I slowed down to a cautious walk, I realized that he wasn't moving toward me, wasn't acting aggressively. He simply shifted his pack, scratched his head, and continued walking down the trail in the opposite direction. My anxiety didn't vanish instantly, but I could see him going farther and farther away, fading into the forest until he was just a shape in the distance. By the time I reached the top of a ridge, I could no longer see him at all. I exhaled fully for the first time that day, realizing I had been holding my breath. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I stayed alert, of course, but the tension had eased. I thought back on the encounter and realized that nothing about him had been overtly threatening. He hadn't spoken, approached, or even glanced at me in a way that suggested hostility. My fear had been a combination of isolation, mental strain, and the instinctive awareness that we are far more exposed out here than in daily life. I reached my campsite by evening, set up my tent, cooked a small meal, and sat by the fire watching the flames. Alone again, but in control this time. The unease hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into a cautious respect for the unpredictability of backcountry life. I realized that most people out here were as normal and friendly as anywhere else. But it only takes one chance encounter to remind you that the wilderness strips away all the rules we rely on in everyday life. And in that realization, I found a strange kind of peace, understanding that fear is natural, that preparation matters, and that most of the time, careful observation and patience are enough to keep you safe. I slept that night without incident, and the next morning when I saw hikers on the trail again, I felt a small wave of relief and connection. The encounter that had unnerved me now seemed like a lesson. To trust my instincts, to respect my surroundings, and to recognize the line between paranoia and reality, which is always thinner out in the wild than in the city. The world was still vast, still wild, and still capable of surprise, but I had walked it and survived it, and that knowledge carried me the rest of the way home. Back in 2010, I set out on a solo bike camping trip through the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. I had a general route in mind, a backroads trip from Portland to Seattle using the Baby Shoe Pass route. I love the idea of exploring on two wheels, alone, carrying just enough gear to survive, but not so much that I would feel weighed down. The thrill of being completely self-sufficient in the middle of the forest was what drew me to these trips. I had done solo camping before, but this was different. I was going deep, looking for trails that barely appeared on maps, wanting to test my own instincts and endurance. One afternoon, I found myself near Big Tire Junction, scanning the forest edge for a trail that might lead to a decent campsite. My plan was always the same: pick a Jeep trail, follow it until it felt right, and then stop. It usually worked. I had my gear packed lightly, a sleeping bag, a small stove, a couple of days of food, and my bike, of course. The weather was crisp but not cold, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth, a mix that felt familiar and comforting. The first trail I tried turned out to be more dangerous than I expected. I had barely pedaled a quarter mile when I ran into a bear. It wasn't a huge bear, but it was close enough that I could see the dark eyes watching me, the slight twitch of its ears, the slow, deliberate movement toward me. My heart jumped. I realized my bike bell was my only defense. I rang it over and over, making as much noise as possible. The bear hesitated, sniffing the air, and then slowly backed off, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned around and pedaled back to the main trail, my heart still racing, feeling a mix of relief and awe. Encounters like that reminded me why I respected these woods so much. I eventually found another trail, a less obvious one, partially overgrown, twisting and narrow. It felt right. I followed it, the crunch of dirt and gravel under my tires, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. About 50 miles from the nearest human habitation, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for the night. It was quiet, shielded from the wind, and just wide enough for me to stretch out. I had no tent, so I would be sleeping in my bag, which wasn't ideal because the mosquitoes were merciless. At around 4,200 feet, they were relentless, swarming in clouds, biting through clothing if I wasn't careful. By 8:30, I had crawled into my sleeping bag, hoping for some respite, the itch of mosquito bites gnawing at me as I tried to calm down and rest. 20 minutes into trying to sleep, I heard an engine. The sound cut through the forest in a way that made my chest tighten. I peeked out of my bag and saw a truck driving down the trail. The headlights washed over the trees, and for a moment I locked eyes with the driver. He passed my camp, disappearing down the trail, and I felt a cold wave of unease. I pulled out my map, confirming that this trail didn't go anywhere for miles and ended after descending into a canyon. I thought about how far I was from any town, any road, any other human. The realization hit me. There were only two people on Earth who knew exactly where I was, me and that guy in the truck. The thought alone made my stomach twist. 30 minutes later, he came back, driving past me again, then vanished into the darkness. I stayed put, too uncertain to make any move, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the occasional distant sound of wildlife. I finally managed a restless sleep, haunted by the memory of the bear and the unknown truck driver. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't shake off, as if it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I moved on, eventually finding an abandoned campground near Taklock Lake. The place was quiet, the remnants of old picnic tables and fire pits half swallowed by moss and undergrowth. I set up in a corner, hidden behind a massive berm placed by the Forest Service, hoping for a night without incident. But that night, some yahoos arrived. They were loud, drunk, and armed, shooting into the air for no reason I could discern. I froze in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, counting the seconds until they moved on. It was clear they had no idea I was there, and I was grateful for the berm and the shadows. I slipped out at 5 a.m., moving quietly to avoid any confrontation. The forest was peaceful in the early morning light, the haze lifting off the lake, the scent of wet pine needles filling the air. I rode out, feeling the tension leave my body with each pedal stroke, the previous night's fear giving way to relief. I spent the rest of the trip moving through the forest, taking in the quiet moments, the endless expanse of green, and the sense of absolute isolation that only comes from being miles from anyone else. When I finally returned to civilization, I realized the trip had changed me in a subtle way. The fear, the quiet, the beauty, and the danger had all combined into something unforgettable. I missed those days, the sense of freedom, the unknown, the feeling that the world was both vast and intimate at the same time. Even though I would eventually return to city life, with its noise and routine, a part of me would always be out there, pedaling down a narrow forest trail, alone, alive, and acutely aware of every sound, every shadow, every heartbeat. I still think about that night in Sequoia National Park more than I want to admit, even though I tell myself it was just a dream. It happened last year when I drove out there alone for a weekend, wanting a break from everything and hoping to get some peace. I slept in the bed of my truck like I usually do when I'm out in the mountains, because it feels safer than a tent, and I like the feeling of being above the ground a little. The campsite was quiet that evening, just faint wind drifting through the tall trees and that heavy silence that big forests always carry after sunset. The kind of silence that makes you feel like the whole place is older than anything you can understand. Right before bed, I climbed onto a big round boulder near my truck because I wanted to see the stars better. The sky was so clear it didn't look real. The Milky Way stretched across the whole thing like someone had painted it. While I sat there, I started noticing small carvings in the boulder, almost like bowls ground into the surface. There were shallow spots, smooth from years of use, and a few long narrow grooves that looked like they had been made on purpose. I knew what they were, or at least what they reminded me of. Mortar bowls, grinding spots, sharpening crevices. Things used by people who lived on that land long before any of us showed up with our trucks and plastic coolers and camp permits. The thought of them sitting there, working on that rock under the same stars, stuck with me as I climbed down and got in my sleeping bag in the back of my truck. I fell asleep fast, faster than I expected. I remember the cold air around my face and the warmth of the bag closing around me. Then I remember opening my eyes again, but everything felt wrong. I wasn't in my truck anymore. I didn't feel the metal bed under me or the sides of the truck around me. Instead, I was lying directly on the ground in the middle of a forest clearing, still zipped in my sleeping bag. The smell of dirt and leaves was strong, and the air felt colder than it had been earlier. I couldn't understand how I had gotten there, and for a few seconds, I just stared at the trees around me trying to figure out if I was still dreaming. When I turned my head to the left, everything inside me tightened all at once. The ground beside me looked like it was moving, but not from wind or shadows. It was a long, twisting mass of black shapes sliding over each other. Hundreds of thin bodies, all glossy and slick-looking, all moving in the same direction. They looked like small black eels, except thicker, and they writhed over the ground in one long, dark river. I could feel a vibration under the dirt, like the movement of all of them together had a low hum to it. I tried to pull away, but the sleeping bag held me tight, trapping my legs. Out of that moving river, a rattlesnake pushed itself up, its body rising through the writhing mass like it was climbing through water. I recognized the pattern on it and the shape of its head right away, and my whole body went stiff. It came straight toward me. I couldn't run, couldn't stand, couldn't do anything but kick. It struck on my sleeping bag once, then again, its head hitting the fabric right near my thigh, but not getting through. I kept kicking, the bag twisting around me, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. After a few more seconds, the rattlesnake pulled back, sliding down into the swarm again, disappearing like it had never been separate from them at all. I finally managed to turn my head enough to see where the mass of snakes was going, and that's when I saw what my head was resting against. It was a large black horse lying on its side, but it wasn't alive. Its stomach had been torn open, a long, deep slice that looked too clean to be made by an animal. The snakes were crawling into the open cavity, sliding over each other and disappearing inside the horse's body. My sleeping bag was pressed against the dead weight of the horse's neck. and the sight of that huge, motionless body next to me made something break loose in my chest. I pulled myself away as hard as I could, dragging the sleeping bag across the dirt, trying to get distance between me and that thing. I could almost feel the cold skin of the horse through the fabric, and for a moment I was sure that if I didn't move fast enough, those snakes would start crawling over me too. The fear inside me got so sharp it felt like it cut straight through whatever part of my mind still believed any of it was real. That was when I woke up for real. My whole body shot upward, and I hit my head on the truck canopy as I jerked awake. I was breathing so hard I felt sick. The sleeping bag was still around me, the metal floor of the truck under my back, the cold night air exactly where it should have been. It took me a long time to steady my breathing enough to realize I was awake. I climbed out of the truck bed and stood there barefoot on the packed dirt of the campsite, shaking so much I almost fell. The trees around me weren't the same ones from the dream. The air didn't smell like the dream air. There were no moving shapes on the ground, no dark mass sliding past me, just stillness and cold and the normal sounds of the forest at night. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat on the edge of the truck bed until the sky started to lighten, watching the boulder where I had been earlier. In the morning light, the carvings looked calm, ordinary, just marks on stone. Nothing strange or threatening about them. But even now, when I think back on it, I don't believe the dream came out of nowhere. I'm not superstitious, and I don't believe in anything supernatural, but I do believe certain places hold memories deeper than we can understand. Old places, especially ones where generations of people lived and worked and died, have a way of pressing themselves into you if you're alone and tired and quiet enough to notice. I can explain it as a mix of exhaustion, the cold, and the intense silence of the forest playing with my mind. I can tell myself that the carvings on the rock only made me think of the people who once used them, and my brain just built a nightmare out of it. That's the most reasonable answer, and it's the one I stick to when someone asks why I don't camp alone much anymore. But the part that still stays with me is how real it all felt. The weight of the horse, the swarm of snakes, the sharp cold on my face, the exact feeling of waking up in a place that wasn't where I fell asleep. I know it didn't happen, but the memory sits in me like something that did. Every now and then, when I think back to that night, I find myself looking over my shoulder for no reason, checking the ground, checking the corners of dark spaces, just to make sure the dream stayed where it belonged. It was just a dream, but it left me with a feeling I can't shake, a kind of reminder that even when you think you understand a place, the land can still work its way into you in ways you don't expect. I still go camping, but I haven't climbed onto a boulder at night just to look at the stars since then. And when I lie down to sleep outdoors, I always make sure the ground under me feels solid, warm, and familiar, because I don't ever want to wake up again thinking I'm lying beside something dead in a forest that I don't recognize. I've spent a lot of time in the backcountry, mostly alone, and I've always respected the wildlife. But there are moments you can't truly prepare for. Moments when the reality of what's out there hits you hard and makes your stomach twist in a way that no guidebook or warning sign can ever explain. I've run into grizzly bears twice on a trail in Glacier Park, and each encounter felt like a mixture of awe and pure, unfiltered terror. The first time, it was an adolescent male, probably around 250 pounds, roaming along a trail I was rounding. I had been hiking early in the morning, and the air was crisp and still, the kind of morning where every breath feels sharp and clean. I turned a blind corner, my boots crunching on the gravel, and there he was, maybe 20 feet away, just standing there, nose to the ground, foraging like he had nothing better to do than sniff out the freshest shoots or roots. He didn't even glance at me at first, completely absorbed in whatever he was rooting around for. My heart froze in my chest. I had been trained to stay calm, to slowly back away if I encounter a bear. But it's one thing to read it in a manual, and another to have a bear that close, that massive, that completely indifferent to your presence. I froze, barely breathing, as he took a few lazy steps forward, sniffed the air, and then wandered off down the trail like I wasn't even there. The sense of relief that washed over me when he disappeared behind a bend was unlike anything else. I walked the rest of that morning like I'd seen a ghost, every shadow and rustle making my nerve jump. The second encounter was with a female grizzly with 2 cubs, each cub as big as a St. Bernard, running and tumbling around her. This time it was later in the summer, the trail narrow, the sun high and bright. I came around another corner and my stomach dropped. The mother was massive, easily 700 or 800 pounds, standing squarely in the middle of the trail. The cubs were nosing around, curious and playful, but you could see the tension in her stance. Her head was low, eyes trained on me, muscles tense like she could spring forward at any second. I froze again, remembering everything I knew about bears. Never run, stay calm. Make yourself big if you have to. But staying calm when you're facing a mother bear with cubs 20 feet away is an exercise in insanity. I took slow, deliberate steps backward, never taking my eyes off her, praying she didn't decide I was a threat. After what felt like an eternity, she nudged her cubs along, and they ambled off the trail. She lingered for a moment longer, sniffing the air, then lumbered into the brush. I sat down on a rock once she was gone, my knees shaking, telling myself over and over that I had done everything right. I had survived, but the memory of that stare, that primal weight of a bear mother ready to defend her young, stayed with me long after the adrenaline faded. Then there are the moose. People talk about bears as if they're the ultimate danger in the wilderness, but they're wrong. Moose are terrifying in a completely different way. I've seen moose up close, massive creatures with thick necks and legs like tree trunks. Their antlers are like weaponized racks, sprawling and jagged, and their eyes seem permanently irritated, like you've stumbled into their world uninvited. Unlike bears, moose don't bluff. They're just angry. They're territorial, unpredictable, and built to destroy anything that gets in their way. I've had more heart-stopping encounters with moose than anything else. One time, I rounded a trail corner and came within 30 feet of a bull. He didn't charge immediately, but the way he glared, pawed the ground, and shifted his weight made it clear that if he wanted me gone, I would have been toast in seconds. You can't reason with moose. They don't see you as a creature to negotiate with. They see you as a moving object that is too close to their personal space. That sense of sheer, raw anger emanating off an animal that can crush your chest with a single stomp is unmatched. Even more memorable was the ram in the Glacier Park parking lot. I had parked my car and stepped out to stretch my legs, thinking nothing could go wrong in a spot full of vehicles and tourists milling around. Then I saw him, a giant, muscular ram, standing near the edge of the lot. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, and heavy, like the ground itself feared him. I froze in place, and before I could take another step, he charged. Not wildly, not out of panic, but with the precision of an animal that knew exactly what it could do to anything in its path. I retreated back into my car as quickly as possible, slamming the door and pressing myself against the seat, heart hammering in my chest. Watching him pace outside, sniffing, eyeing the tires and doors like I was a minor inconvenience, made me realize how fragile human beings really are in the presence of something built purely to dominate the landscape. I stayed in the car until he wandered off, never once breaking eye contact with him. That day, I understood that even in areas full of people, wild animals are still wild. They don't care about your schedules, your expectations, or your safety. They are raw, untamed, and immensely powerful. What ties all these encounters together is the absolute respect I now carry for the wilderness. It's not romantic. It's not some heroic tale of man versus nature. It's survival, pure and simple. I learned the importance of always scanning ahead, staying aware, carrying bear spray, and never underestimating the animals that share the trails with you. I've never walked the same path the same way again, never taken a blind corner lightly, never assumed safety in a parking lot. These experiences have left me cautious, yes, but also alive in a way few other experiences can. Nature demands respect, and I've learned that firsthand. I've seen the bears, the moose, the ram, and I know now exactly how close you can get to death without ever being touched. And every time I step back onto the trails in Glacier Park, I carry that memory with me, heart ready, mind alert, understanding that being careful isn't paranoia. It's the difference between leaving the park in one piece and not leaving at all. Even now, I can feel the weight of their presence in my chest, the memory of that raw power and indifference. It humbles you, teaches you caution, and leaves you grateful for every step you take unscathed. Nature is beautiful, but is also unforgiving. I've learned to move through it quietly, respectfully, and always aware that a single misstep can bring you face to face with a force you cannot control. It's a lesson I will never forget, and one that keeps me alive every time I lace up my boots and step onto the trails again. I moved to the woods a few years ago because I wanted space, quiet, and a place where my kids could grow up without cars flying past the front yard. I knew the area had black bears, and I was fine with that. They were big, loud, and scary if you surprised them, but at least they were something I understood. I knew how to handle bears. I knew how to back away, how to make noise, how to keep food sealed. What I wasn't ready for was everything else that didn't fit into any normal category, things that didn't make sense no matter how many times I went over them in my head. The woods around the house looked peaceful in the daytime. They had this soft look like a giant green blanket wrapped around the whole area. Tall pine trees, thick brush, slow-moving deer that wandered through the yard like they owned the place. But the longer I lived there, the more I noticed how quickly that peaceful look could change. By evening, the trees looked darker and heavier, like something was hiding behind them. I try not to think about it too much. I kept telling myself the brain plays tricks when you're out in the middle of nowhere. But deep down I knew it wasn't just my brain. One day I was out walking with my niece. She was 16 at the time and always asked to go out exploring whenever she visited. We weren't far from the house. The area was pretty open, just tall grass with a thin line of trees behind us. I remember the sun was out and the air felt warm and calm. Nothing about the moment felt dangerous. We were just walking, talking about nothing important. Then out of nowhere, I heard a growl. It wasn't loud like a bear. It wasn't high like a cat. It wasn't from the trees or the bushes. It was right behind us, no more than 2 feet away, like something had been walking right at our backs without making a sound. The growl was deep and mean, like something angry was letting us know it was close. It hit harder than anything I had heard in those woods. My niece froze, and I froze. We looked at each other at the exact same time, and both had the same expression, like every part of our bodies suddenly wanted to run. There was nothing in sight. No movement, no shadow, nothing. Yet the growl had been so close, I could almost feel the vibration in my chest. We didn't even talk about it. We just turned and ran the whole way back to the house. My legs were shaking by the time we got inside, and I could still feel that growl stuck in my head hours later. I kept replaying it, trying to match it to anything I knew. But there was nothing. It didn't belong to anything normal living out there. After that, I kept noticing smaller things. My daughter came running inside one afternoon, her face pale and confused. She said she heard me calling her from the edge of the woods. She said she heard my voice clearly tell her to come here. I had been in the kitchen the entire time, not even near a window, not saying a word. I didn't like how certain she was. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't unsure. She believed it was me because the voice sounded exactly like mine. I didn't know what to say to her. I just brought her inside and told her to stay close. But that stuck with me. I knew sound carried weird in the woods, but not like that. Not perfect. Not identical. A neighbor eventually told me something that should have been comforting, but actually made everything worse. She said she sometimes saw a woman dressed like she was from the 1800s standing inside her house or between the trees. She said she also saw a little girl in a nightgown with long dark hair. Both looked real, and both looked angry whenever she saw them. I didn't believe in that kind of thing and still don't, but hearing her talk about it made my stomach twist. I didn't see anything like that myself, but it wasn't the images that bothered me. It was the way she described the feeling, like someone was watching her even when nothing was there. That feeling had been creeping up on me for months, and I didn't want to admit it. I kept telling myself there must be normal reasons for everything, but every day something pushed that belief a little harder. The deer were the easiest to notice. They acted wrong. They moved slow like they didn't care who was around, but their eyes were alert in a way that didn't match their bodies. More than once I saw them all staring in the same direction, toward the darker part of the woods, like something was standing there out of sight. They didn't run. They didn't eat. They just stared. And when I tried to follow their line of sight, I never saw anything. But I felt something. A pressure. A weight. The kind that makes your chest tight, even though you aren't scared yet. Like your body is reacting before your mind understands why. The longer I stayed in that place, the more all the strange things started linking together. The growl that didn't match anything. The voice my daughter heard that sounded too perfect. The animals acting tense and confused. And that constant feeling that something stood just out of sight. It felt like someone or something had been watching us from the day we moved in. Not ghosts or monsters or anything like that. Something real. Something physical. Something smart enough to stay just far enough away that we couldn't see it, but close enough that we could feel it. The final moment that made it all clear came late one evening when I was locking up for the night. I stepped onto the porch and heard movement in the woods, slow and heavy, like footsteps. They weren't from a deer and not from a bear. They were spaced out like something walking upright. I stood still and listened. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. Started when I shifted my weight. Stopped again when I froze. It was copying me, matching me, staying just far enough that I couldn't see it through the trees. But it was there, and it wanted me to know that it was there. That was the moment everything clicked. All the strange sounds, the feeling of being watched, the things my kids heard, the way the animals acted. Something had been living out there long before we arrived. Something that didn't want to be seen, but didn't mind being heard. Something that wanted us to know we were never alone, but also wanted us to keep our distance. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or a woman from the 1800s. It was something real and breathing and watching. Something that had learned how to move quiet, how to imitate sound, how to stay just hidden enough to keep itself safe. I still live here, and I still hear things sometimes. But now I understand what the woods were trying to tell me from the beginning. These woods aren't empty. They never were. And as long as I stay aware, stay cautious, and respect whatever else is sharing this place with me, things stay calm. The ending is simple and clear. I'm not alone out here, but I understand the rules now. Stay alert, keep your distance, and never ignore the signs. The woods always warn you if you pay attention. I spent most of my career in a place where the ground never really felt steady and the air never fully relaxed. Every day had its own weight. Some days were calm, some days were strange, and some days kept me awake long after I came home. When people ask me about the scariest moments out there, I never know where to start because the truth is the fear builds over time. It layers itself into you. It starts small, and then it grows, and then it settles deep in your bones. It changes what you notice, how you move, how you think. It teaches you that the simplest sound in the wild can change your whole life if you're not alert to it. One of the earliest times I felt that shift was a morning when I woke to the sound of water moving in a way that didn't match the tide or the small lake beside my tent. I opened my eyes to a soft splash, the kind that meant something heavy was pushing water aside. I lay still and focused on my breathing, keeping it slow because I didn't want whatever was out there to hear me. The bear was swimming toward the edge of my camp, and I could picture the slow, strong strokes, the sound of its body gliding through the water. I had set the tent away from the shoreline, but not far enough to relax when I heard something like that. When an animal that big decides to check out your camp at dawn, you feel your pulse in places you never think about. I stayed still until I heard the water settle, and then I waited longer, listening for any step on shore. When I finally crawled out of the tent, I saw the wet marks on the stones, the shape of paws larger than my open hand. It reminded me that everything out there was shared ground, not mine. But experiences don't always come one at a time. Some stack on top of each other. Like the afternoon, I was running a survey along a narrow stretch of brush where the air felt tight. I had been focused on the ground, on the small signs and measurements I needed, so I wasn't thinking about who or what might be following behind me. The wind was low, and the brush held the smell of the damp earth, so I didn't hear anything at first. Then I felt it, not a touch, not even a full sound at first, but a presence. I turned my head just enough to see the shape behind me. A sow and her cub were about 15 meters away, close enough for me to see the shine on their noses. The sow gave that short, steady sniff, the one that means she caught your scent and wants to understand it. She wasn't charging, but she wasn't carefree either. They had followed the line of my trail the same way I followed the lines of the land. I moved slowly, as steady as I could, not fast enough to trigger anything, not slow enough to look unsure. My legs shook, but I kept them moving until I had enough distance for my lungs to work again. Fear changes shape when an animal is hurt. A healthy bear has a logic you can predict, but a wounded boar, especially after losing a moose cache, moves with a kind of frustration that doesn't follow patterns. That night at my tent camp, I could feel the tension in the air long before I saw him. The nearby cache had been torn up earlier in the day, and I knew the boar that lost it would not take the loss lightly. When he pushed into camp, he moved like he didn't care about anything except what he had already lost. I hazed him off, slow steps, arms raised, trying to keep distance while also showing him I wasn't giving ground. He turned away, and I felt a moment of relief, but he stopped and swung his head back toward me. There was something unsettling in the way he kept changing his mind. He turned away again, walked a few steps, then came back again like he couldn't decide if I was a threat or a target or just another thing in his way. It took time, too much time, before he finally wandered off for good. When he was far enough that the brush swallowed the sound of him, I sat down just to let my knees stop shaking. Nature can scare you without any animals at all. The weather out there has its own personality, and sometimes it feels almost angry. I once spent 48 hours in a remote plywood cabin during a willow-waw that never eased up. The wind held steady at around 40 miles per hour, and the pumice from the slopes slammed against the walls with each gust. It sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown again and again. Every shockwave ran through the boards, through the floor, through my bones. The cabin felt like it was breathing with the wind, expanding and tightening in small groans that made it feel alive. I couldn't sleep because every time the gusts picked up, I pictured the whole structure pulling apart, boards ripping loose, and the cold air taking over everything. By the end of those 2 days, my ears were ringing from the constant noise, and I felt like my nerves had been sanded down by the pumice too. Crossing a glacial river doesn't feel like weather or wildlife. It feels like facing a decision you can't avoid. I stepped into the cold water with a 50-pound pack pulling at my shoulders, and the shock of the cold hit me so fast it felt like my body stopped for a second. The current pushed against my legs hard enough that every small step felt like a full argument with the water. I moved slow, testing each spot with my pole, feeling for rocks that could shift under me. With each second in the river, I knew a misstep wouldn't give me a chance to recover. The cold would take my strength fast, and the current would do the rest. When I reached the far bank, my legs felt stiff and heavy, but I sat for a long time, just letting myself feel solid ground again. People think those moments are the worst. They think the animals or the weather or the land are the things that test you the most. But the moment that changed me, the one that still wakes me up sometimes, didn't come from the ground or the water. It came from a sky. I heard the first cough in the engine of the small plane and knew it wasn't just a sputter. The sound dropped, lifted, dropped again, and then it cut out completely. The silence after an engine dies in the air is something you don't forget. It's not real silence. It's the sound of speed without power. It's the sound of air hitting the frame with nothing driving it forward. My stomach dropped, and for a moment everything felt too bright, too sharp. I could feel every bump in the air. The plane felt lighter, almost loose. I kept my hands steady on the controls, trying to focus on glide, on distance, on anything that gave me even a small sense of control. The land below looked both too close and too far. But the thing about fear is that it makes you focus. It makes you let go of anything that doesn't matter. I found a stretch of land that looked just barely long enough. The landing was rough, hard enough that my teeth snapped together, but the wheels hit ground instead of water or rock, and the plane skidded to a stop. When everything finally stilled, I let out a breath I didn't know I had held. I sat there for a long time because my hand was shaking too much to move. The silence felt different now, solid, like something I had earned. People ask me why I still work out there, why I stay in a place that gives me moments like that. The truth is that fear never really leaves, but it also never completely rules you. You learn to move with it, not away from it. You learn that surviving those moments means you're paying attention. It means you're still part of the land, still learning from it, still alive in it. And when I think back on all of it, every close call, every long night, every sound that made my pulse jump, I know exactly why I stay. The land teaches you what you're made of. And the moment you stop listening to it, that's when it stops giving you chances. I was 12 years old, and it was the first time in my life I had ever slept anywhere other than my own house without my family. It was a school trip for 7th grade, 5 hours away from home, and everyone else acted like it was supposed to be fun. They were excited about hiking, campfires, and cabins. All I felt was a slow, sick feeling in my stomach the whole ride up, like my body already knew I wasn't built for this. I hated every second of being away. I hated the smell of the cabin, the stiff wooden cot that felt like someone took a broken picnic table and stretched a thin pad over it, the echo of kids laughing outside when I just wanted silence. The place didn't make me feel free the way the teacher said it would. It made me feel stranded. By midnight, I still hadn't slept. Everyone around me breathed slow and steady, half snoring, shifting in their sleeping bags. The air inside the cabin felt hot and stale, like it had been trapped there for years. I could feel sweat drying on my back every time I rolled over. My mind kept spinning on the same thought over and over. I wanted to go home. Not in the morning, not after breakfast, not after the trip. Right then, I wanted my own room and my own bed and the sound of my parents talking down the hallway. I knew I wouldn't get any sleep in that cabin, so I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to bump into the nearby frame, because the whole thing creaked like an old barn. Outside, the air was cool enough to bite a little at my cheeks, and everything was almost painfully quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wide open, but also tight around your chest at the same time. The cabins were set along a short gravel path, surrounded on all sides by woods that looked endless in the dark. I sat on the top step with my knees pulled close and opened the Christopher Pike book I had brought. I had a tiny book light clipped to the top, and that little glow felt like the only safe thing out there. I tried to focus on the words, letting them drown out the feeling that I wished I was anywhere but this strange place. I told myself that I just needed to make it until morning. I tried to pretend the trees weren't pressing in around me, and the shadows weren't moving with every soft breeze. But the longer I sat there, the more wrong everything felt. Not loud wrong, not obvious wrong, just that slow-building tension that crawls up between your shoulder blades and makes the hair on the back of your neck rise without you giving it permission. Every couple minutes, I caught myself looking up from the book, even though nothing made sound. It felt like someone wanted me to look up. No reason, no logic, just that old instinct kids get before they even understand what danger is. I kept staring at the darkness in front of the cabin. There was nothing unusual at first, just the split rail fence we passed earlier that day and the edge of the steps where the gravel started. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It sat deep in me, something old and heavy, something that made me want to pull my legs closer and make myself smaller, even though I didn't understand why. Then, while I was shifting the book in my hands, the light from the tiny lamp moved a little to the side. It swept across the darkness in a thin arc, and that's when I saw them. Two glowing shapes, round, still and low to the ground. For a second, my brain didn't process what I was looking at. My first thought was that maybe one of the counselors had left something reflective out there. But then the shapes blinked. Slow, deliberate, alive. My breath stalled halfway on my chest. My hands tightened around the book, and my whole body froze. I lifted the light again without thinking, and the glow landed on a paw at the bottom of the steps. A huge paw, the kind of size that didn't match anything I had ever seen in person. My eyes followed it up without meaning to, like my brain was forcing me to understand even though I didn't want to. I saw the shape of the shoulders, the long body, the smooth muscles shifting just enough to show it was ready for whatever came next. And then it hit me all at once. A mountain lion, a real one, not a story, not a zoo animal, not something on a nature documentary. A real mountain lion sitting in the dark, watching me from only a few yards away. My heartbeat felt like it was in my throat. The air moved in and out of me in tiny, shallow breaths. I knew two things immediately, two thoughts that crashed together and almost made me dizzy. First, if I didn't move soon, someone would be finding blood and pieces of me at sunrise. Second, if I survived, but ended up mauled because I was outside when I wasn't supposed to be, my dad would be furious. It was a strange mix of fear, survival, and the kind of kid logic where getting in trouble still outranked everything else. I didn't even realize I'd dropped my book until I heard the tiny clatter of the plastic lamp falling sideways. The light slipped off the porch step, landing so the beam pointed off to the left instead of in front of me. I didn't dare look away from the lion, but now I could only see its outline and those eyes reflecting what little light was left. I started reaching behind me for the cabin door. I didn't want to make sudden noise, didn't want to break eye contact, didn't want to do anything that might make it shift or step closer. But my fingers brushed only wood. I slid my hand to the right, then up, then to the left again. Every second felt like a full minute. My arm shook so much I could feel the muscles twitching all the way to my shoulder. Finally, my fingers touched cold metal. I closed around the handle, so slowly I barely felt it move at first. When it turned, it made the softest click, and even that tiny sound felt too loud. Just as I pulled the door open, my balance slipped and I fell backward into the cabin. I kicked the door shut with my heel, pushed myself off the floor, and got back into bed as fast as I could without waking the whole room. I lay there shaking, so hard the cot creaked under me. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. When morning came, the cabin filled with the noise of everyone rushing around. One girl asked why the door had been open earlier. I said the wind probably blew it. I kept quiet when the teacher complained about the library book being outside on the ground, damp with morning dew. I didn't say a word about what had actually happened, because I knew no one would believe me and I didn't want any more trouble. I just pushed through the day, pretending everything was normal, even though my body still felt like it was stuck in that moment on the steps. As an adult, I understand how close I came to something awful. A mountain lion could have ended me that night. It didn't, and I still don't know why. Maybe it wasn't hungry. Maybe the light confused it. Maybe it decided I wasn't worth the risk. But I remember those eyes every time I think about camping. I remember how small I felt. How stupid. How lucky. The truth is simple and clear. I almost got killed on my first night ever camping, and nobody ever knew. I walked away from it like it was nothing, but it sits in me even now like a quiet reminder that nature doesn't care how old you are or how scared you are. It just watches, waits, and decides. And that night, for reasons I'll never understand, it decided to let me go. I was driving home from Yosemite 4 years ago, and the sun was low enough that everything had that warm, soft glow that makes the world look calm, even when you're exhausted. I had been on the road for hours, my legs tight and my back stiff, so when I saw a wide pull-off on the side of the road, I decided to stop for a quick break. It was around 5 in the evening, still plenty of daylight left, and the air felt cool after being inside the truck for so long. I left the engine off, stepped out onto the gravel, and walked a little bit into the brush so I could relieve myself. It felt like a normal roadside stop, nothing unusual at all. While I stood there, I could hear the faint sound of birds echoing through the trees. They weren't loud, just those random scattered chirps you hear all the time in that area. The road itself was quiet, no other cars passing by, just the sound of the wind moving through the branches. Then, in the span of maybe a second or two, every single bird stopped making noise. It didn't fade out. It just cut off like someone flipped a switch. The silence around me suddenly felt heavier, like the air had tightened. I knew enough about the woods to know that when everything goes quiet at once, it usually means a predator is close, and my first thought was a bear. I cut things short and zipped up while scanning the trees, even though I couldn't see far into them. My truck was only about 30 feet away, not far at all, but I still felt that small jolt of adrenaline kick in. I started taking slow steps back toward the truck, watching the shadows between the trees more than the path in front of me. The stillness didn't feel natural. It felt like something was holding the whole area in place. Right as I turned my body fully back toward the truck, I heard a sound behind me so loud and so strange that it hit my chest like a physical shove. It was a mix between a scream and one of those old air raid sirens you hear in documentaries, but deeper and more raw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a cougar, it wasn't anything I had ever heard in my entire life. It didn't sound like an animal warning another animal. It had this rising tone to it, like it kept climbing the longer it went on. The trees seemed to vibrate from the sound, and for a second my legs refused to move because it startled me so badly. But then everything inside me kicked into survival mode. I ran. I didn't even think. I sprinted as fast as I could across that short stretch of dirt and gravel, almost slipping once because my boots hit a loose patch. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear the pulse in my ears. I remember grabbing the door handle with shaking hands, yanking it open, and practically throwing myself inside. My breath was coming out sharp and uneven. I slammed the door shut like something was right behind me, even though I didn't turn around long enough to look. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it so fast that I almost snapped it. The engine came to life with that rough sound it makes when it's been sitting for a bit, and right before I shifted into drive, the sound came again. This time it was even louder, like it was twice as close, and it didn't sound like it was coming from just one direction. It seemed to echo all around me, like the air itself was carrying it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I felt this deep, instinctual fear that I can't fully explain. I didn't wait for the sound to finish. I floored the gas and pulled back onto the road, gravel spitting under the tires. As I picked up speed, my hands were gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, even though I couldn't see anything except the fading pull-off and the line of trees. The sound didn't follow me, or at least I didn't hear it again after that second scream. I drove for miles without stopping, my heart still beating too fast, my throat dry and tight from how hard I had been breathing. Even after I reached a more populated area, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched me as I ran. Something that wasn't bothered by cars or people or noise. Something that simply existed out there in the quiet places where most people never linger. For weeks after that, I found myself replaying the sound in my mind, trying to make sense of it. I listened to recordings of mountain lions screaming, and even though those can get creepy, it still wasn't the same. I played videos of bears, foxes, elk, even strange ones like bobcats and wolves. Nothing matched the tone, the rise, the raw force of what I heard. At the same time, I never once felt like it came from something supernatural or impossible. It didn't feel like a ghost or a monster. It felt like a living creature out there in the woods, something rare or maybe just something I was unlucky enough to hear at close range. A wildlife expert could probably give me a better answer, but I learned that elk can make some incredibly intense vocalizations during certain seasons, and foxes can scream so sharply that people mistake them for humans. Big cats can make horrifying noises too, especially when they're injured or fighting. Out in the woods, sounds get warped by distance, echo, terrain, and wind, making them seem bigger or stranger than they really are. On a quiet evening with no other noise around, and your senses already tense from the birds going silent, almost any powerful call can feel unreal. The more time that passed, the more I realized that the fear I felt came from not understanding what I heard, not from the sound itself, proving something unnatural. Wildlife doesn't care if we know all their sounds or not. Animals don't announce every behavior they have to humans. Sometimes they make noises we almost never hear because we are rarely in the right or wrong place at the right time. And I happened to stop on a quiet road at the exact moment something out there decided to call out for its own reasons. I still think about that day, but I'm no longer convinced it was anything mysterious or paranormal. I think it was just a wild animal making a powerful call that I wasn't familiar with, amplified by the silence of the woods and the fact that I was alone and vulnerable. The fear was real, but the cause was probably something completely natural. It didn't chase me, it didn't track me, and it didn't approach my truck. It only made a sound, and then the forest went back to being a forest. And that's what helps me go back into the woods without that same fear. Nature is loud, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying, but it's still nature. What I heard was almost certainly an animal, not a cryptid, not something supernatural, just something that I wasn't ready for in that moment. It scared me, but it wasn't hunting me. It wasn't stalking me. It was just living its life out there in the quiet, and I just happened to step too close to its part of the world for a few minutes. I was never the same after the two things I found in the woods, And even now, when I try to tell the story, I can feel my stomach tightening the same way it did when I was a kid. I grew up thinking the outdoors was safe, clean, open, and honest. I thought danger came with loud sounds, or fast things, or big animals. I didn't understand how silent danger could be, or how something dead could sit right in front of you and wait for you to discover it like it was meant for you. When I was 8 or 9, my mom took me with her to a reservoir near a national park. She made baskets from natural materials, and she always brought me along so I could help collect reeds and long grasses. Back then, I would pick up trash too, because she gave me a nickel for each piece. At that age, finding trash felt like treasure hunting. I held a bag in one hand and a small basket in the other, just wandering along the lake shore, feeling helpful, feeling useful, feeling like I was doing something good. It was late morning, the sky bright, but with a thin haze over it. The water looked calm except for these small ripples that tapped the shoreline. I remember little round stones under my shoes and the smell of wet earth. The place felt so open that nothing there seemed capable of hiding anything. I felt safe enough to walk a little farther from my mom while she cut reeds. She trusted me to stay close, and I thought I was close, but kids don't really know distance the way adults do. I spotted what looked like a glove lying half in the water and half on the shore, fingers spread a little, palm down. It looked bloated and pale from a distance, but I thought maybe it was just a rubber glove filled with water or mud. I bent down and reached for it without thinking. My fingers closed around it the way you'd close your grip around a piece of trash you want to impress your mom with. The moment I lifted it, the weight was wrong. It didn't feel like trash. It felt soft and sagging, with a heaviness at the wrist end. It took my brain a moment to catch up with what my hand was touching. I turned it slightly in my grip and saw the torn, swollen edge of a real wrist, the skin pale and waterlogged, with a few inches of arm still attached. The fingers were wrinkled like they had been soaking in the water for days. I remember the color of the nails. I remember the way the thumb hung loose, almost bent backward. I remember the cold of it through my own small fingers. That detail is what stayed with me the longest, that cold weight. I started screaming. The hand fell, but somehow my own hands clenched around it again. My fingers locked, and I couldn't let go no matter how hard I tried. I remember the way my arms shook. I don't remember running. I don't remember my mom running to me. I only remember the moment she forced my fingers open to make me drop it. She wiped my hands on her shirt over and over, like she was trying to take the dead feeling off them. We got back to the car and drove straight to the nearest gas station to call the police because this was before cell phones. Everything was loud in my head. People moved around me and talked, but I didn't hear any of it clearly. The police went out and collected a hand. Later, when I was older, I learned that a group of teenagers had been drinking and using a powerboat. One fell in or got too close to the propeller. I had found what the water kept. After that, I didn't talk for about 2 months. Something about touching something so recently dead did something to me. Even now, if I see an animal that has been dead only a short time, my throat closes up. I can't breathe right for a few minutes. It's like my body remembers that cold weight all over again. By the time I was in college, I thought I was mostly over it. I still avoided lakes, but I liked hiking and camping. It made me feel alone in a way that was supposed to be healthy, like nature was a place where I could reset after a long stretch of stress. One spring semester was especially rough. I barely slept. I was anxious all the time. So after finals, I decided to camp for a few days in southwestern Colorado. I picked an area far from busy trails. I didn't want to talk to anyone or see anyone. I just wanted to breathe without feeling crowded. I hiked most of the day with a pack that felt heavier than it should have. The air smelled like pine and dust, and the ground was soft in places where the needles piled up. I tried to enjoy it, tried to let each step shake stress loose from my shoulders. At some point, I heard voices far behind me. A group of hikers. I didn't want company, not even polite company. I turned off the trail, figuring I could angle back to it later, maybe a mile ahead. I just wanted peace. The woods got thicker the farther I moved. Branches clawed at my clothes, and the ground dipped in ways that made me step carefully. I kept going anyway, thinking the main trail was straight ahead. I wasn't scared, just annoyed at the brush and wanting quiet. Then I stepped into a space where the air felt different, almost stale. The trees were close, but there was a small clearing between them, quiet in a way that made my skin tighten. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. In the center was something like a table made entirely of bones. Long bones, short bones, flat bones. Some bleached white, some still stained brown. They were stacked and fitted together in a way that wasn't sloppy. Someone had done this slowly, on purpose. Around it, bones hung from strings along with bits of metal that clinked when a breeze passed, though the air barely moved. They looked like ribs, femurs, vertebrae, maybe from deer, maybe from smaller animals. Some pieces were tiny enough to be from birds. It was a mix of everything. I froze. I felt the same coldness climb my arms that I felt the day I held this severed hand, like the past had reached out and grabbed me again. I knew it wasn't some natural pile. No animal would arrange bones like that. No wind would tie them up on strings. Someone had been here doing something, and I didn't want to know what that something was. I backed up slowly, careful not to touch anything. The silence around me felt pressed in, like the trees were holding it in place. Every step felt like it made too much noise, even though I was barely moving. I didn't want to breathe. I didn't want to disturb whatever I had walked into. I didn't want anyone to know I had seen it. When I was far enough to turn, I forced myself to find the trail again. I didn't look back. When I reached it, I walked as fast as I could without running. Then, when I felt like no one could see me, I ran the rest of the way to my car. I drove without stopping until I reached a town big enough that I didn't feel alone anymore. I never went camping again after that. I still hike sometimes, but only on popular trails where I can hear other people's footsteps and distant conversations. I need that noise now. Total silence feels wrong. The two things I found in the woods, years apart, changed how I see the world. They reminded me that nature isn't always peaceful, and people aren't always harmless, and sometimes the worst things you stumble on are the ones nobody meant for you to find. I can sit with that now. I can live my life. I can keep going. But I don't wander off trails anymore, and I don't pick up anything that looks like a glove. When I think back to that night in Mar Twain National Forest, it still feels like my mind keeps drifting into a memory that never settled down. Even now, at 43, the whole thing sits in my head like it only happened last week. I was 10 then, small, skinny, and always trying to stay out of the way when my stepfather had been drinking. When we pulled into the forest that evening, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, and it felt like we were racing daylight from the moment the car stopped. There was no campground, no lights, no other people. Just a small patch of flat ground and miles of trees closing in around us. I remember the air felt heavy, like the darkness was building itself before I could even blink. We worked fast, or at least my mother and sister did. My stepfather complained the whole time, blaming everyone for not moving quickly enough, even though he was barely helping. My mom told him earlier that day that we didn't have a lantern, but he didn't listen, and by the time we realized we really didn't have it, the last of the daylight was slipping between the branches. The tent went up in a crooked mess, the bags were tossed inside, and the car door slammed shut behind us like some rushed warning. The forest around us went from dim to pitch black in minutes. I had never seen darkness like that. It didn't feel natural, like the trees were swallowing every bit of leftover light. My stepfather kept yelling, angry about the missing lantern, angry about the setup, angry about everything. The sound of his voice seemed too loud for the dark, almost like it pushed deeper into the woods than it should have. My mother tried to calm him down, but his voice just kept rising, sharp and messy. After a while, he gave up on the idea of a campfire, said it was too dark and too late, and crawled into the tent. We followed because it was the only thing we could do. Inside the tent, everything felt smaller. I could smell the old nylon and the dirt beneath us, and I could hear my stepfather's uneven breathing as he drifted into that angry half-sleep he always fell into when he drank too much. My sister lay stiff next to me, staring at the ceiling fabric like she was waiting for it to fall on her. My mother lay between us and my stepfather, not asleep, not calm, just trying to hold everything together in the dark. None of us talked. We just lay there listening to the quiet pressing in from every side. Then the quiet changed. At first it was so faint I thought I imagined it. A soft rustle, like something brushing across the leaves. But then it came again. A slow, steady shift of dead leaves, like footsteps far away, but not far enough. The sound carried through the trees, not rushed, not clumsy, just steady, like someone walking with purpose, but not hurrying. I felt my chest tighten because it didn't match anything else that night. There were no lights anywhere. No campers. No fire. No cars driving by on a nearby road. Just us. Alone. And something moving toward us. The steps were too heavy to be an animal that I knew of. Too slow and spaced out to be something four-legged. It felt human, and the thought of a person moving through the trees without a flashlight in that darkness made my skin crawl. Minutes felt like whole hours as the sound kept coming closer and closer. Every time the leaves shifted, I felt the ground under my sleeping bag vibrate, just a little. My hands were sweating even though the air felt cold. I knew the others were awake too. My mother's breathing went shallow. My sister's legs twitched against mine. My stepfather shifted, but not the normal way he did in his sleep. This was different, like he was listening too, even through his drunken fog. The footsteps reached a point where I could tell they were only yards away. They slowed down, almost paused. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I remember staring at the thin tent wall, knowing how easy it would be for anyone to just pull it open or cut through it or press their hand against it. The sound started again, one slow step, then another. Then a twig snapped. Not a small twig. A loud, sharp crack that echoed through the trees like something breaking in half. Everything inside me locked up. I felt myself freeze so completely that even breathing felt wrong. And then my stepfather, who had been still for minutes, suddenly let out a scream so loud and so raw that even now it echoes in my dreams. He didn't sound tough. He didn't sound angry. He sounded terrified, like everything he kept buried inside him burst out at once. My mother moved so fast I barely understood what happened. She grabbed at us, pushed us, and we all scrambled out of that tent at the same time. I didn't think about anything. I didn't look behind me. I just ran. My feet hit the cold ground, slipping on leaves and roots. I kept my eyes on the vague shape of our car, barely visible in the darkness, and hoped nothing touched me from behind. My parents were ahead of us somehow, even in their panic. My stepfather ran like something was chasing him, and my mother stayed just close enough to make sure we kept moving. The forest felt alive around us while we ran. I could hear more leaves moving behind us. Or maybe it was my imagination, but I didn't care. I kept running until the car door slammed behind us, and the engine started with a violent shake. The headlights flicked on and showed nothing but thick woods and the crooked outline of the tent in the distance. No person, no movement, just darkness. But none of us were going back. Not for the tent, not for the bags, not for anything. We drove home without speaking. I sat in the back seat, shaking so hard my teeth hurt. Every time the car hit a bump, I thought something was grabbing the bumper. My mother kept looking in the rearview mirror, even when there was nothing behind us but miles of empty road. My stepfather didn't say a word. Not once. We never went back for our things. My mother told me years later that she didn't even care about losing them. She just wanted to get us out of there alive. And even though nothing actually happened to us, nothing touched us or attacked us, that night changed something deep inside me. The fear never really left. Even now, decades later, I still dream about those footsteps. I dream I'm back in that tent, lying in the dark with no lantern, listening to something moving through the leaves. I dream about the sound of that twig snapping and the feeling that someone, some stranger walking through the forest with no light, came close enough to reach out and touch the tent. And in every dream, I never see who it was. I never find out what they wanted. I only relive that moment right before we ran. That moment when the darkness felt like it was full of someone else's breath. I hate camping because of that night. Not because of stories or movies or imaginations. Because once, when I was 10, someone walked through the woods in total darkness toward our small tent, and we were just a family lying there with no light, no protection, and no idea what waited outside the fabric walls. And the truth is, I still believe that if we hadn't run when we did, something in my life would have ended differently. Maybe not in a dramatic way, maybe not in a violent way, but something would have broken inside me permanently. So I live with the memory. I live with the dreams. And I live knowing there are moments in the woods when someone can walk close to you in the dark, with no light, no sound except their footsteps, and you may never know why they came so close or what they were looking for. I always thought I knew those woods better than anyone. I grew up walking those hills with my cousin and my dad, and every year we waited for deer season like it was some kind of holiday. My cousin's property in western Wisconsin stretched over hills that rose and fell like waves, covered in oak, maple, and thick brush that stayed dark even when the sun was bright. Over the years, the men in my family built a hunting shack there, nothing fancy, just wood walls, a metal roof, a potbelly stove, and a board on the wall where we marked where we would be hunting that day. We also built tree stands all over the hills so nobody had to walk too far or climb anything unsafe in the dark. Opening morning of deer season always felt the same. Cold air that bit the tips of my fingers, breath hanging in front of my face, the kind of quiet that only happens before the sun comes up. My dad and I left earlier than the others. We always did. It was still dark when we rolled the ATV out from behind the shack. We marked which hill we were heading to, even though nobody else had shown up yet. It was just habit. We always wanted everyone to know where we were so nobody would accidentally walk into our line of fire. The ride up the hill was rough and slow. The ATV bounced over old ruts and rocks hidden under leaves. The smell of wet dirt and cold air mixed together in a way that told me winter wasn't far off. When we got to the top of the hill, the woods were still dark, but had that faint blue glow that comes right before sunrise. We set ourselves up in the tree stand, sitting still, waiting for the light to hit the valley. Usually we'd at least hear squirrels running or a distant deer breaking branches somewhere, but that morning was too quiet. Not calm quiet, just empty. By the time it hit 9 a.m., I still hadn't seen anything. No movement, no sound, nothing. It felt strange, almost like the woods were holding their breath. My dad made a motion that we should pack up and head back down to warm up and grab coffee. I didn't argue. My toes were stiff and my fingers felt slow, and the idea of holding a hot drink sounded better than sitting in the cold hoping something might show up. We climbed down and started walking down the hill toward the ATV. I matched my dad's steps like I usually did. I learned that trick early. When two people step at the same time, it sounds more like one moving animal, and deer don't get as spooked. It also keeps the noise down. We stopped every so often to look around and listen, hoping we might catch a deer moving late. But the woods stayed dead quiet. About halfway down, I heard something behind us. At first I thought it was just the echo of our own footsteps bouncing off the hillside, but it didn't match the rhythm. It wasn't off by much, just a tiny bit behind, almost like someone trying to copy the steps, but not quite getting the timing right. I turned my head a little and listened harder, thinking maybe it was another hunter who didn't check the schedule. But the property was private. Nobody came out here unless they were supposed to. I pushed the thought away and blamed it on the strange quiet of the morning. We walked a little farther and again it happened. Every time we stepped, I heard almost the exact same sound half a beat behind me. I knew how the forest sounded. I knew what deer steps were like, what turkeys sounded like, even the hop of a rabbit landing on leaves. This wasn't any of those. This was a human step, the weight of it, the way the leaves crushed underneath, the way it paused when we paused. It was almost identical to my steps, but not my dad's. That detail stuck out immediately. Whoever or whatever it was wasn't copying both of us. Just me. The hairs on my neck lifted and I stopped walking. I stared back up the hill. The trees were thick, and that early morning shade still clung to the ground, even though the sky was brightening. I didn't see anything, but something felt wrong. Not in a supernatural way, just in a very real, very physical way. Like being watched by someone who isn't supposed to be there. I kept telling myself it was an animal and nothing more, but I'd never heard an animal move like that before. I turned and kept going, trying to keep my breathing steady. We were close enough to the ATV that I could almost see the glint of the metal through the brush. I told myself I was overthinking it. Then I heard it again, and this time the sound wasn't trying to match my rhythm. It was just walking, clear as day, right behind us. I turned while still moving, and that's when I saw something duck behind a tree farther up the hill. It was fast, but I caught enough of it to feel my stomach drop. The skin looked too pale for someone who lived around there. The woods were cold, but not cold enough for someone to lose that much color naturally. I stared hard at the tree, and for a moment nothing moved. Then a face poked out. It was far enough away that I couldn't see the details clearly, but I could tell the features didn't look right. The shape seemed off somehow, almost flattened or stretched in places where a human face shouldn't be. The eyes looked sunken, like they sat too deep in the skull. It didn't blink. It didn't move except to lean a little more, like it wanted to study me. My whole body felt like it tightened at once. I couldn't understand why someone would be there, or why they would follow us quietly, or why they would hide like that instead of calling out or showing themselves properly. The face didn't look like someone injured or lost. It looked like someone who had been outside too long, someone who hadn't eaten right, someone whose bones hadn't grown the right way. And something about the way it watched me felt sharp, like it was trying to understand something about me in a way that wasn't normal. I kept staring as I backed down the hill. My legs felt heavy and my chest felt like it was shrinking. The face didn't go away. It just stayed there, watching. When we reached the ATV, I still had my eyes locked on it. Then its shoulder came out. The arm looked wrong, twisted at the elbow in a way that made it hang too loosely. The body that followed looked thin, almost sickly, but not in a natural way. More like the bone structure underneath had grown crooked and never corrected itself. I couldn't tell if it was a man or something else, but it was human enough that my brain kept trying to classify it. The moment the ATV engine started, it flinched but didn't run. It just stood there watching as we tore down the hill. I didn't turn away until the trees blocked my view completely. Even after that, I kept checking behind us as we hit the bottom of the hill and sped toward the shack. When we got there, the place was empty, which felt both relieving and unnerving. We didn't talk. We didn't wait. We just got in a truck and left. For days afterward, I tried to figure out what I saw. There were no stories about missing people around there, no rumors of squatters living deep in the woods. The land belonged to my cousin, and he checked it often. There weren't any old cabins or structures where someone could hide. Nothing made sense. I never went back after that. I still can't put a name to what I saw. I know it wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was a person, but a person who didn't look right, didn't move right, and didn't seem to live the way normal people do. Someone who had been out there long enough to move through the woods like an animal, but still understand what footsteps sound like. Someone watching us and trying to blend their movements with mine. My dad still hunts there. He says the woods are normal, that nothing strange has happened. He got a deer this morning and acted like the whole thing never happened. But I think about it more often than I want to. I think about the pale face, the twisted shoulder, and the way it stared like it was trying to figure out what we were. And I know something real was standing on that hill with us, something human enough to follow but broken enough to hide. I don't know why it watched us. I don't know how long it had been out there. But I know what I saw, and I know I'm not going back to those hills again. I remember the day clearly, even though it happened years ago. I had been a park ranger in a remote section of the Cascades for about 3 years at that point, and I had grown used to the isolation. That particular week had been quiet, the trails empty, and the weather unusually warm for early fall. It was the kind of day where the sun hits the leaves just right, the kind of day that almost tricks you into thinking the forest is safe and calm. I was patrolling on foot, the usual routine, checking for illegal campers and ensuring the trails were clear. My truck was parked near a small ranger station a few miles off the main road, but I had decided to take the old service trail into the deeper sections. It was narrower, overgrown in parts, and hadn't seen much traffic for months. The forest was dense, the trees towering high with their trunks thick and dark. Every few minutes, I would hear the distant call of a crow, the rustle of leaves under small animals, or the snap of a branch that wasn't my own. At first, it felt normal, the kind of sounds I'd learned to live with. But as I walked further in, I noticed something off. I began seeing signs of someone else in the area. There were footprints, partially washed out by the morning dew, leading off the trail and into the thick underbrush. At first, I thought it might be hunters from earlier in the week, but the prints didn't match deer, and there was no sign of any vehicle tracks anywhere nearby. I followed the trail carefully, my ranger-issued boots crunching on fallen leaves. The footprints seemed recent, and they led deeper into the forest, away from any known campsite. The air grew cooler under the thick canopy, and shadows stretched long between the trees. I kept my radio in my hand, but there was no signal this far in. The forest was quiet except for the occasional distant bird or rustle of leaves. My gut told me something wasn't right. I had been alone in worse situations before, but this felt different. About an hour into following the trail, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The ground was disturbed, flattened in the center as if someone had set up a temporary camp or worked on something. There were scraps of plastic, a few empty food wrappers, and a small metal box partially hidden under a pile of leaves. The thing that caught my attention, though, was a tree with deep claw marks gouged into the bark. They were wide and fresh-looking, as if someone or something had been trying to climb or mark the tree with force. My heart started beating faster, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I pulled out my flashlight from my belt and shined it across the clearing. Nothing moved, but the shadows seemed darker than they should have. I decided to mark the spot and head back, but as I turned, I noticed something else. There was a faint trail of broken branches leading further into the woods, almost like the person or animal had fled in a hurry. The deeper I walked, the more the forest seemed alive with sounds I couldn't identify. Twigs snapped behind me at regular intervals, and the wind seemed to carry distant, unnatural echoes. I wasn't panicking yet, but my body was on edge. I kept telling myself it was probably a bear, or maybe a deer, something natural. But the way the sounds moved, almost deliberately, kept making me glance over my shoulder. By mid-afternoon, the sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, and the shadows stretched long and oppressive. I was still following the trail, though now I had a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Then I saw it, a figure moving quickly between the trees. Not a full human silhouette, but something upright, moving erratically, almost hiding behind every tree. I stopped immediately, crouched low, and watched. The figure paused, looked toward me, or at least in my direction, and then bolted further into the forest. I realized I had two choices: pursue it blindly in the dark or backtrack and report what I'd seen. I chose the latter. My training had drilled into me that the forest could be dangerous, and I had no backup. As I retraced my steps, I noticed more signs that the person, or whatever it was, had been following me. Small sticks snapped behind me, leaves rustled, but when I turned, nothing was there. My pace quickened. I kept my radio ready, hoping for a signal. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I finally reached my truck. I locked the doors, checked the radio, and reported the situation to the main station. Later, a search team went in to investigate, but they didn't find anyone. There were no camps, no signs of a permanent presence, and the claw marks on the tree had faded slightly with the wind. Still, every time I walked that area after that, I felt eyes on me. I never saw the figure again, but the memory of that day stayed with me. The sense of being watched, the sounds that weren't quite natural, the feeling that someone or something had been testing me. Eventually, the forest calmed back to its usual quiet rhythm, but I learned to respect the unknown in the backcountry more than I had before. I learned that even trained eyes and years of experience don't always prepare you for the unexpected. Some parts of the forest remain wild not just because of nature, but because of what people or things might be hiding there. I never returned to that exact trail alone, and I always carried extra gear and a trusted partner when I had to patrol that section again. That day reminded me why being a ranger isn't just about maintaining trails or handing out permits. It's about understanding the forest rules and knowing when to step back before curiosity gets you in trouble. I have been a park ranger for just over 6 years, mostly in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. I liked the isolation, the quiet hum of the forest, the way the sunlight dappled the moss-covered trunks in the morning. But there was a reason I stayed on this side of the park, away from the bigger, more tourist-heavy trails. It was quiet out here, too quiet sometimes, and I had learned the hard way that quiet could hide things. It was late September, and the air had that sharp, cold edge that hinted at winter. Most of the regular hikers had stopped coming through, so the trails were mine alone. I had been driving along an old fire access road on the east side of the park, checking on some beaver activity near a small creek. The radio in my truck crackled with faint static, mostly dead air, except for the occasional low voice from dispatch. The forest was unusually silent that day. Not even the normal rustle of squirrels or the high-pitched chatter of birds. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every tiny sound your own body makes. The creak of your boots, the slap of your coat against the seatbelt, your own breathing. When I reached the Old Creek crossing, I parked the truck and grabbed my usual gear: binoculars, notebook, camera, and a small first aid kit. I knew the beavers had been damming the stream further upstream, and the flooding was starting to eat into one of the old trails. I followed the creek slowly, stepping carefully over mossy logs and damp rocks. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves was strong, almost cloying, and I noticed the occasional snap of a branch, though I was careful to watch my own movements. After a few minutes, I noticed something unusual. The tracks. They were not the beaver tracks I expected, not even deer or raccoon. They were bigger, human-sized, but not recent. The dirt around the creek was soft from recent rain, and the tracks had been pressed in deep, almost deliberately. I followed them cautiously. My heart rate picked up slightly, not out of fear, but out of that heightened ranger awareness you get when something in the environment is just off. The tracks led away from the creek into a thicker part of the forest, where the sunlight barely touched the ground. Fallen branches and undergrowth slowed my pace, and I realized I was far off any trail. There was no cell signal here, which wasn't unusual, but today that fact carried weight. I paused, scanning the area. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I could hear my own heartbeat, a dull drum in my ears. I took a deep breath, reminding myself I wasn't alone in the forest in any threatening sense. Rangers know the woods, and the woods usually tell you what's safe. But these tracks didn't belong to anyone I knew. They were too deep, too purposeful. I followed the trail cautiously for another 20 minutes. Then I found a campsite. It wasn't a formal site, just a small clearing with a fire pit half filled with cold ash and a few pieces of burnwood. No tent, no supplies, nothing recent. What unsettled me was the arrangement of the fire pit. It wasn't random. The stones were stacked unusually straight, like someone had spent time carefully arranging them. There were more tracks around the clearing, as if someone had been pacing in the dirt, circling the fire. I pulled out my camera and took a few photos, careful not to make any sudden movements. As I backed away, I heard it, a branch snapping from deeper in the woods. Not far, but not right next to me either. I froze. My body tensed. I knew whoever, or whatever, had been here was still in the area. I didn't see anything, not even a glimpse, but instinct told me to leave. I turned slowly and started retracing my steps back toward the truck. Every step felt heavier than the last. The forest seemed to close in around me. Then I heard again, louder this time, a footstep. Not a deer bounding through the leaves, not a bird flapping from a branch. It was deliberate, heavy, following my pace. My skin went cold. I didn't run. Rangers are trained not to panic, to observe, to think. But my pace quickened. Another snap, closer now. I could feel eyes on me, though I didn't see anyone. Finally, I reached the fire access road. My truck was just a few dozen feet away. I climbed in and locked the doors without a glance back. I kept the engine running for several minutes, scanning the tree line until the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew long. The footsteps never came closer, but I could feel the forest shift around me, as if it were aware I had intruded. By the time I reported the tracks to dispatch, the details had become harder to pin down. They didn't find anyone in the area, no evidence beyond the tracks and the oddly arranged fire pit. But I knew what I had sensed was real. The forest doesn't lie. It doesn't make mistakes. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting. I never found out who, and I don't know if it was dangerous or just someone who had gotten lost and decided to observe the trail I was checking. After that day, I made it a habit to always check the access roads before heading into remote parts of the park. I never saw the tracks again, but I always felt in the quiet moments of the forest that eyes were still out there, always watching. And as a ranger, you never forget the way the woods can feel alive with the unknown. That's the lesson I carry every time I lace up my boots, even years later. The forest is calm, but it's never empty. I have been a park ranger in the Northern Rockies for nearly 7 years, mostly patrolling dense forests, steep ridges, and winding mountain roads. That summer was one of the hottest I'd seen in a decade, and I have been assigned a stretch of backcountry trails known for heavy foot traffic in the spring, but nearly deserted by late August. The forest was thick, a mix of towering firs and scattered lodgepole pines, the air dry and heavy with the smell of pine resin and dust. One morning, I set out before dawn, driving my old Ranger truck along a narrow, gravel forest road that wound past deep ravines and silent meadows. I had a route mapped for checking trailheads and camping areas, making sure fire risks were low and campers weren't breaking rules. The road twisted unpredictably, and cell service was spotty at best. By the time the sun broke through the ridges, I was halfway down a steep slope near a trail called Iron Creek. I had noticed tire tracks the day before, new, deep, and not from any authorized vehicles. That alone made me uneasy. Rangers rarely get surprises from nature itself, but humans could be unpredictable and dangerous. I parked near a small pull-off and grabbed my patrol pack. First aid kit, walkie, water, my standard issue sidearm, and a flashlight, even though it wasn't dark yet. I decided to follow the tracks a little way. They led off the main road into a narrow jeep trail, partially overgrown with shrubs and fallen branches. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Birds weren't singing, and the wind barely stirred the trees. Even the squirrels seemed to have disappeared. My boots crunched over dry pine needles, and I noticed the tracks weren't just vehicle tracks. They looked like someone had been on foot following the vehicle. I followed the trail for maybe a mile, my eyes scanning constantly. Something about the way the tracks overlapped made me uneasy. Whoever had been here wasn't just hiking. They had been deliberately hiding, covering paths, making sudden turns. I paused at a clearing and looked around. The sun was higher now, light spilling in through the trees, and I thought I heard a snap, a branch breaking somewhere behind me. I froze, scanning every shadow. Nothing. I kept walking, tried to convince myself it was just an animal. But then I came across something that stopped me cold. A small campsite, hastily abandoned. A burnt-out fire, a few scattered cans, and what really caught my attention, a backpack lying on its side, half buried in leaves, with a dark stain along the bottom that looked like dried blood. My stomach tightened. I radioed in the location, telling dispatch I had found signs of a potentially injured or dangerous person. By the time I got back to the truck, I had that creeping awareness you sometimes get in the backcountry, the sense that you're being watched. I chalked it up to nerves, but as I drove slowly back down the gravel road, I kept glancing into the trees. Shadows seemed deeper than they should be, and shapes in the undergrowth looked like they moved. I was alone. I was trained to handle solitude, but there was something off, something human. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a bend in the road near a river crossing. The gravel ended, giving way to a ford that was shallow but muddy. I slowed to inspect it and noticed footprints in the mud, boot prints, not mine. They were fresh and led straight toward the river, disappearing on the far bank. I felt a twinge of dread. I wasn't supposed to be chasing anyone. I was supposed to observe and report, but instinct pulled me toward the footprints. I parked and followed them on foot, staying low, keeping the sun at my back. The forest thickened again, and the air grew colder as shadows from the cliffs above stretched over the trail. I stumbled across more signs. A dropped flashlight, torn clothing snagged on branches, footprints zigzagging in ways that suggested panic or desperation. And then I found what seemed like a small clearing where someone had tried to hide. There were deep gouges in the dirt, like someone had scratched at the ground, and more bloodstains. My heart was pounding, but I pressed on. Rangers don't get the luxury of fear slowing them down. The job demands curiosity, careful observation, and patience. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and realized I was deep into territory I rarely ventured into. The sun was low, long shadows stretching between trees, and I had no idea where the tracks had gone. I decided to call it. I marked the location on my GPS and started heading back to the truck. That's when I saw movement, a figure crouched behind a fallen log maybe 50 feet away. I froze. The figure didn't move fast, didn't make a sound, just crouched there. It was a human adult, ragged clothing, mud-caked, staring at me with eyes wide, unblinking. I didn't approach. I didn't call out. I slowly backed away, keeping my flashlight pointed toward them without shining directly in their eyes. The figure stayed put, watching as if frozen in place. Once I reached the truck, I drove off slowly, keeping an eye in the rearview mirror. The figure remained at the edge of the clearing until the road curved out of sight. Back at the ranger station, I filed a report. Dispatch checked local missing persons reports. Nothing matched what I had seen. 4 days afterward, I patrolled the area again. I found signs, occasionally footprints, discarded items, but the figure never appeared again. I told myself it was someone hiding, someone scared or unstable, surviving in the backcountry. There was no magic, no ghost, no twist of fate. Just someone lost, dangerous, and real. In the end, the incident reinforced everything I already knew about the job. Out there, it isn't always the forest or the animals that are dangerous. It's the people. Someone can disappear into the woods, survive, and remain unseen for days, and the forest will keep their secrets better than any person ever could. The summer ended, the trails grew quieter, and the forest returned to its normal rhythm. But I never forgot the weight of that day, the sense that something was out there, watching and just out of reach. I never saw the figure again, but the memory stayed, clear and sharp, a reminder that the wild is bigger than you think, and sometimes being alone doesn't mean being safe. I remember the day clearly, even though it happened years ago. I had been a park ranger in a remote section of the Cascades for about 3 years at that point, and I had grown used to the isolation. That particular week had been quiet, the trails empty, and the weather unusually warm for early fall. It was the kind of day where the sun hits the leaves just right, the kind of day that almost tricks you into thinking the forest is safe and calm. I was patrolling on foot, a usual routine, checking for illegal campers and ensuring the trails were clear. My truck was parked near a small ranger station a few miles off the main road, but I had decided to take the old service trail into the deeper sections. It was narrower, overgrown in parts, and hadn't seen much traffic for months. The forest was dense, the trees towering high with their trunks thick and dark. Every few minutes, I would hear the distant call of a crow, the rustle of leaves under small animals, or the snap of a branch that wasn't my own. At first, it felt normal, the kind of sounds I had learned to live with. But as I walked further in, I noticed something off. I began seeing signs of someone else in the area. There were footprints, partially washed out by the morning dew, leading off the trail and into the thick underbrush. At first, I thought it might be hunters from earlier in the week, but the prints didn't match deer, and there was no sign of any vehicle tracks anywhere nearby. I followed the trail carefully, my ranger-issued boots crunching on fallen leaves. The footprints seemed recent, and they led deeper into the forest, away from any known campsite. The air grew cooler under the thick canopy, and shadows stretched long between the trees. I kept my radio in my hand, but there was no signal this far in. The forest was quiet except for the occasional distant bird or rustle of leaves. My gut told me something wasn't right. I had been alone in worse situations before, but this felt different. About an hour into following the trail, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The ground was disturbed, flattened in the center as if someone had set up a temporary camp or worked on something. There were scraps of plastic, a few empty food wrappers, and a small metal box partially hidden under a pile of leaves. The thing that caught my attention, though, was a tree with deep claw marks gouged into the bark. They were wide and fresh-looking, as if someone or something had been trying to climb or mark the tree with force. My heart started beating faster, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I pulled out my flashlight from my belt and shined it across the clearing. Nothing moved, but the shadows seemed darker than they should have. I decided to mark the spot and head back, but as I turned, I noticed something else. There was a faint trail of broken branches leading further into the woods, almost like the person or animal had fled in a hurry. The deeper I walked, the more the forest seemed alive with sounds I couldn't identify. Twigs snapped behind me at regular intervals, and the wind seemed to carry distant, unnatural echoes. I wasn't panicking yet, but my body was on edge. I kept telling myself it was probably a bear, or maybe a deer, something natural. But the way the sounds moved, almost deliberately, kept making me glance over my shoulder. By mid-afternoon, the sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, and the shadows stretched long and oppressive. I was still following the trail, though now I had a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Then I saw it, a figure moving quickly between the trees. Not a full human silhouette, but something upright, moving erratically, almost hiding behind every tree. I stopped immediately, crouched low, and watched. The figure paused, looked toward me, or at least in my direction, and then bolted further into the forest. I realized I had two choices: pursue it blindly in the dark or backtrack and report what I'd seen. I chose the latter. My training had drilled into me that the forest could be dangerous, and I had no backup. As I retraced my steps, I noticed more signs that the person, or whatever it was, had been following me. Small sticks snapped behind me, leaves rustled, but when I turned, nothing was there. My pace quickened. I kept my radio ready, hoping for a signal. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I finally reached my truck. I locked the doors, checked the radio, and reported the situation to the main station. Later, a search team went in to investigate, but they didn't find anyone. There were no camps, no signs of a permanent presence, and the claw marks on the tree had faded slightly with the wind. Still, every time I walked that area after that, I felt eyes on me. I never saw the figure again, but the memory of that day stayed with me. The sense of being watched, the sounds that weren't quite natural, the feeling that someone or something had been testing me. Eventually, the forest calmed back to its usual quiet rhythm, but I learned to respect the unknown in the backcountry more than I had before. I learned that even trained eyes and years of experience don't always prepare you for the unexpected. Some parts of the forest remain wild not just because of nature, but because of what people or things might be hiding there. I never returned to that exact trail alone, and I always carried extra gear and a trusted partner when I had to patrol that section again. That day reminded me why being a ranger isn't just about maintaining trails or handing out permits. It's about understanding the forest rules and knowing when to step back before curiosity gets you in trouble. I had been a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest for nearly 5 years by the time the incident happened. I knew these forests like the back of my hand. Every trail, every creek, every hidden offshoot that only the most stubborn explorers ever stumbled across. I prided myself on that knowledge. It was early October, and the forest had begun its slow turn into autumn. The leaves were mottled gold and red, and the air had that sharp, clean bite that made you want to pull your jacket tighter. I had been assigned to a routine patrol that morning, checking the backcountry trails for campers, hikers, and any potential hazards. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another day keeping the forest safe. I started at the main ranger station around 6:30 a.m., logging in, checking the weather reports, and reviewing the last few incident logs. Everything was normal. I loaded my truck with the essentials: first aid kit, ranger radio, spare water, rope, flashlight, and a small toolkit. I preferred working alone for these patrols. It allowed me to move quietly, hear the forest properly, and keep my own rhythm. I drove down the main access road, past the small campgrounds, and eventually took a dirt back road that led deep into the forest, an area known locally as Pine Ridge. The road twisted between dense stands of fir and cedar, narrow enough that a single vehicle had to inch carefully through, and the ground was slick from the recent rain. The first few hours were calm. I stopped to check on a couple of day hikers who had lost their map, but were otherwise fine. I noted a few broken branches across a smaller trail, probably from a recent storm. Everything was routine. I drove on, heading toward a section of trail that wound along a creek. The area had been quiet lately, and I wanted to see if there were any signs of illegal activity, people camping outside of designated sites, cutting firewood, or leaving trash. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was just a subtle feeling, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I was halfway down a narrow trail when I saw a faint glint of sunlight reflecting off metal in the brush. I slowed and stopped. My truck's engine echoed in the stillness of the forest. The glint wasn't far off the trail, maybe 15 feet to the right, just beyond a cluster of ferns and fallen logs. Curiosity and instinct kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and stepped carefully out of the truck. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves, muffling my steps. As I approached the brush, I saw what it was, a set of tire tracks leading to a small clearing. Not unusual, except the tracks were fresh, maybe a day or two old, and they didn't match the legal trails. That was when I saw the abandoned truck. Half buried in a shallow ditch, mud crusted along the sides, windows fogged and cracked. Its doors were locked, and there was no one inside. I circled the vehicle carefully, scanning the surrounding forest. My radio crackled faintly, but there was no response from anyone else. The forest seemed to hold its breath. That's when I noticed signs around the clearing. Impressions in the soil, flattened underbrush, disturbed leaves leading further into the trees. Footprints, multiple sets, some large, some small, scattered and heading in no particular direction. I noted all of this in my mind and on paper, but a creeping unease settled over me. This was not normal. I decided to follow the tracks, keeping the abandoned truck in view. My flashlight cut through the shadows as I walked deeper into the forest, the light bouncing off the trees and illuminating patches of moss and lichen. The footprints wound around, sometimes disappearing and reappearing. I realized that whoever or whatever had left them was moving with intent, not randomly. That thought tightened my chest. I kept going, my hand hovering over my sidearm, my other hand holding the flashlight steady. Hours passed as I tracked deeper into the forest. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the trail. I noticed broken branches higher up in the trees, as if someone had climbed. There were patches of disturbed ground that suggested a struggle had occurred. A few drops of blood, a torn sleeve snagged on a branch. My heart began to pound. I called it in over the radio, describing what I had found, but reception was patchy, the static of the mountains and trees interfering. I pressed on, determined to understand what I was seeing. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. The air was colder here, sharper, almost metallic. In the center lay an old hunting cabin, abandoned decades ago, but someone had clearly been here recently. The door hung open, and inside were remnants of a camp, cans of food, a small fire pit, scraps of clothing. The footprints led straight inside. I took careful note, then moved around the cabin. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling behind me. I spun, flashlight scanning, but there was nothing. Then again, a crack of a branch, closer this time. I realized I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching, maybe following. The sun had set entirely now, leaving the forest cloaked in darkness. I radioed back, giving precise coordinates, and waited. Within 20 minutes, backup arrived. We combed the area thoroughly, and although we found more footprints and signs of someone living rough in the forest, we found no one. Eventually, after hours of searching, we returned to the ranger station. The truck was towed, the cabin logged, and the area posted for further investigation. Weeks later, the investigation revealed that the truck had been stolen in Portland, and the person responsible was a fugitive hiding out in the forest. They had vanished before the authorities could catch them. I never saw them, but the traces they left behind were more than enough to remind me that the forest, for all its beauty, is unpredictable. The sense of being watched, of moving through the quiet knowing that someone else is near, stayed with me for months. I learned that even in places where you feel safest, the forest holds secrets, and the quietest paths can be the most dangerous. I had been a park ranger for almost 7 years by the time that day happened, working in one of the more remote sections of the national forest. The forest itself wasn't famous, at least not to the general public, but to someone like me, it was a vast expanse of old-growth trees, thick underbrush, and winding, poorly maintained logging roads that crisscross valleys and hills. My routine was usually uneventful. Patrols in the morning, checking trails, making sure people weren't doing anything illegal, responding to minor injuries, and keeping wildlife reports. It was peaceful, predictable, and most importantly, safe. At least, that's what I thought until the day I encountered something that reminded me just how unpredictable nature could be. It started on a late October morning. The fog was hanging low, heavy and gray, a kind that sinks into the valleys and creeps through the trees. I was scheduled for a solo patrol, driving my old, beat-up Ranger truck down one of the forest's lesser-used roads. My goal was to reach a small lake tucked deep in the north section, a place that was perfect for a short hike and usually untouched by anyone but occasional hunters and hikers. I had my usual gear, a radio, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a sturdy knife strapped to my belt, and my old rifle in the truck just in case. The day was quiet, eerily quiet, but at first I thought nothing of it. Birds chirped sporadically, the wind rustled through the trees, and the faint scent of wet leaves filled the air. The road to the lake was narrow, overgrown in places, with roots and fallen branches making it tricky to navigate even in a truck. I had to drive slowly, keeping my eyes sharp for any movement. About an hour into my drive, I noticed something unusual, a series of deep tire tracks veering off the road and into a small clearing. The tracks were fresh, the mud still soft and slightly shiny, indicating that someone had passed through very recently. I parked a little way down the road and got out to inspect. The clearing was small, no more than 50 feet across, surrounded by tall pine trees. I followed the tracks a short distance into the trees and realized they led to a small, makeshift campsite. It wasn't legal, but that wasn't what caught my attention. The campsite looked abandoned. The fire pit had cold ashes. A small tent was collapsed at the edge of the clearing, and there were signs of someone having left in a hurry. A backpack half open with supplies scattered, a pair of muddy boots tipped over near the edge of the tree line. My gut tightened. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just that someone had left in a hurry. It was how quiet it was. There are no birds now, no wind through the treetops, nothing except the soft, unsettling crunch of my boots on the forest floor as I stepped closer. Then I noticed the scratches on the trees near the tent. They were deep, vertical gouges, rough and erratic, like someone had been trying to climb or escape. And nearby, partially hidden under leaves, were footprints not human. Large, wide, and heavy. My training told me it could be a bear, but bears don't usually make that kind of mess in a campsite or leave tracks that looked almost like oversized human feet. I took out my radio and tried to call headquarters, but there was nothing. Just static. My phone had no signal either. I had a sense of isolation I had never felt in all my years in the forest. I decided to backtrack to the truck, hoping to radio in once I reached the road. That's when I heard it, a faint, low grunt coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. I froze. My mind ran through every possibility. Wounded animal, another person hiding, maybe a lost hiker. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, measured, not the random noises you usually hear in the forest. I gripped my knife, but instinctively, I reached for the rifle in my truck. Slowly, carefully, I backed toward the road, trying not to make any noise. The next hour was a nightmare. Every step I took, the grunting followed, echoing through the fog. I could see glimpses of movement, shadows slipping between the trees, but nothing clear. At one point, I stumbled into a shallow creek, wetting my boots, and the sound of water seemed to anger whatever was following me. The grunting got louder, faster. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. Then, suddenly, silence. I froze, listening. Nothing. I slowly raised my head and saw the faint outline of a figure, hunched, standing about 30 feet away in the fog. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew if I ran blindly, I could trip or get lost. I raised my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. It was massive, easily over 6 feet, broad-shouldered. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was human, but the way it stood, the unnatural stiffness, made my stomach turn. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving faster than anything human should move. I ran back to my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove slowly, constantly scanning the tree lane, until I finally reached the main road. The radio crackled to life then, and I called my location, explaining the abandoned campsite, the tracks, the grunting, and the figure. Backup arrived within an hour, and we searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything, just the abandoned campsite, now eerily silent in the daylight. It took days for my adrenaline to settle. I returned to that section of the forest several times after, but the fog was never as thick, the forest never as quiet. Whatever I saw that day, I never encountered it again, but it reminded me how unpredictable the wilderness can be. It reminded me that even as a trained ranger, prepared for emergencies, the forest has its own rules, and sometimes we're simply intruders, not in control. That day changed how I approached my patrols. I learned to respect the forest even more, to move cautiously, and to always trust the feeling in the pit of my stomach. Nature can be quiet, beautiful, and deadly all at once, and sometimes it's the silence that tells you the most. I remember the day like it happened yesterday, even though it was years ago. I've been a park ranger for a few seasons at a large national forest in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of forest where the trees were so dense you could barely see the sky, and the moss grew thick on everything, turning fallen logs into soft green couches. It was mid-October, and the air was damp and chilly, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your fingers stiff even inside thick gloves. I had been assigned to do a solo patrol that week, checking the backcountry roads and trails for any illegal activity, fallen trees, and hikers who might be lost or in trouble. I started my day early, driving my old Ranger truck down gravel roads that twisted like snake paths through the forest. The smell of wet earth and pine was thick, and a low fog hugged the valleys, making everything look like it belonged in a different world. I passed the usual spots, old logging remnants, abandoned campsites, creek crossings, but today something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was subtle, just a heaviness in the air, a quiet that felt unnatural. Normally, even in remote areas, you'd hear birds, the rustle of small animals, the distant drip of water from leaves. Today, there was almost nothing. I parked my truck at a small pullout and decided to hike a short trail that ran along an old Jeep track. My plan was to check the trail for fallen trees and make sure it was safe for the weekend hikers. I had walked this trail countless times, but as I went deeper, I realized I didn't recognize some of the landmarks. A bend in the creek, a cluster of rocks. Even the slope of a hill seemed wrong. My gut tightened. I chalked it up to the fog, but my steps slowed. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were tire tracks along the muddy edge of the trail, recent, fresh, and wide, like a heavy vehicle had passed through. That wasn't unusual, except the tracks didn't lead anywhere obvious. They curved sharply off the trail into the dense trees, disappearing into the fog. I took out my radio to call it in, but there was no signal. The deep forest often killed reception, but hearing that silence pressed on me, heavy and suffocating. I decided to follow the tracks. I wasn't sure why. Part of me knew I shouldn't. A ranger's instinct is usually to investigate, but this was different. The forest seemed to close in around me as I moved. Branches snagged at my jacket, moss squished underfoot, and the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to barely 10 feet. Every small sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, a rustle in the underbrush, the drip of water from the trees. My eyes strained for anything out of place, and that's when I saw it. A figure, or what I first thought was a figure, stood just beyond a fallen log. At first, I froze. The shape was hunched, tall, and still. My heart started pounding. I reminded myself it could be a hunter, or maybe a worker, but no one was supposed to be this far back without checking in. I raised my flashlight and clicked it on, swinging the beam slowly toward the figure. It was gone. Nothing but empty forest. I stepped forward cautiously. Then I noticed the signs. This part of the forest had been heavily logged years ago, leaving behind jagged stumps and fallen branches. But these weren't natural. There were fresh marks on the trees, deep gouges, almost like claw marks, but they were too high and too even for any animal. Then I found a small campsite, hidden in a hollow under some thick ferns. It was makeshift, crude, with a tarpaulin between two trees and a fire pit that had burned recently. Ashes were still warm. That's when the rational part of me realized someone had been here, watching the trail, possibly tracking me. I stepped back slowly, my boots crunching on wet leaves. Every nerve in my body screamed to leave, but I didn't want to run blind into the fog. I memorized landmarks, marking my way with small sticks as I retreated along the trail. My radio still had no signal. I could feel the presence. Someone was following me, keeping their distance, moving silently. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the glow of my truck's taillights through the mist. Relief hit me like a wave, but I stayed low and moved cautiously. I reached the truck, jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove slowly down the gravel road, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. There were footprints in the mud on the side of the road, running parallel to my truck for a while before disappearing into the woods. They were human, barefoot, and impossibly fast. Whoever or whatever had been following me had stayed just out of sight, letting me think I was alone. When I got back to the ranger station, I filed a detailed report. Rangers later checked the area, but there was no sign of anyone, no campsite, no tracks, nothing. Only the eerie memory of being watched and the scratches on the trees. I never found out who it was, but that day changed the way I patrolled. I stopped hiking alone in deep fog, always stayed near roads, and learned to trust the quiet instincts that tell you something is wrong long before you see it. Even now, years later, I still remember the cold, the fog, and the sense that something unseen was tracking my every move. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, human, and terrifying in the way only someone invisible in the woods can be. That's what made it scarier than anything else I've ever faced. The knowledge that someone had been close enough to touch me, and I never saw them. And I survived because I stayed calm, observed carefully, and didn't panic. A lesson that has saved me more than once in the wild. Back in the spring of 2012, I was working a week-long solo patrol in one of the more remote sections of the Cascade Mountains. The area I was assigned to was a patchwork of logging roads, overgrown jeep trails, and abandoned campsites. The kind of place that rarely saw visitors except for the occasional lost hiker or illegal off-road vehicle. I liked this part of the job because it gave me complete solitude and a chance to really know the forest, but it also had a way of getting under your skin when you were alone for too long. I started my day early, before the sun was fully up, checking the condition of the backcountry roads and ensuring that no one had left trash or signs of illegal activity. My truck was packed with all the usual gear: first aid kit, radio, spare water, and a rifle. Not because I expected trouble, but because the area was known for aggressive wildlife, especially black bears and cougars. The morning was clear, the air crisp, and everything felt normal. By mid-morning, I decided to check an old Jeep trail that cut into a densely forested section. The trail had been used decades ago for logging, but nature had reclaimed most of it. Trees leaned precariously over the path, and thick underbrush pressed against the edges of the trail. The farther I drove in, the narrower the path became, until eventually I had to abandon the truck and continue on foot. I was making slow progress, scanning the area for downed trees and signs of wildlife. That's when I noticed it. Tire tracks, not fresh, but recent enough that they caught my attention. They were wide, like from a truck or an SUV, and headed deeper into the forest. The thing that made me uneasy was the spacing. These weren't just casual tracks. Whoever had made them had been moving fast, maybe even recklessly. I followed the trail on foot, my boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. The forest was quiet in a way that made you notice every small sound. A branch snapping under my weight, the rustle of leaves, birds calling far off. I rounded a bend and saw something that made my stomach knot. There was a campsite, a recent one, judging by the charred remains of a fire and an overturned cooler. It didn't look abandoned in a casual way. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I started circling the site, scanning for clues. The fire was mostly out, but there was still a faint smell of smoke. Empty cans and a backpack lay scattered around. Then I noticed footprints leading away from the camp, deeper into the forest. That's when my gut went cold. Something about the tracks made me pause. They weren't just hiking tracks. They had the irregular pattern of someone trying to move quietly and quickly, like they were hiding from someone or something. I decided to follow them, keeping low and moving cautiously. The forest got thicker, the light dimmer as the afternoon shadows stretched across the trail. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing. That's when I saw him, or rather, him and the truck. A man, mid-30s, scruffy, pacing near a battered SUV with the engine running. I couldn't hear his words, but he was muttering to himself and glancing around nervously. Something about him screamed trouble. I didn't want to confront him directly, so I stayed back, hidden behind a thick stand of pines, trying to decide my next move. I radioed dispatch to report a suspicious individual in the backcountry. They told me to keep an eye on him and not engage unless necessary. As I watched, he suddenly grabbed something from the back of the truck, a large, heavy bag, and ran into the woods. My pulse jumped. I had no idea what was in the bag, and at that point, all I could do was follow from a safe distance. The man was fast, but he wasn't careful. Branches whipped across his face, roots threatened to trip him, and still, he kept moving deeper into the forest. After nearly 20 minutes, he slowed down near the edge of Small Creek. I could see him kneeling, pulling the bag open. That's when I realized it was full of stolen property, electronics, camping gear, even a small generator. My chest tightened. Whoever he was, he had been raiding backcountry campsites, probably for weeks. I stayed hidden and observed until he eventually stuffed the gear back in the bag and disappeared into the forest again. I marked his location on my GPS and slowly made my way back to my truck. Once I was sure I was at a safe distance, I called local law enforcement and gave them a full report. They took over the investigation, and I returned to my patrol route, shaken but relieved that I hadn't been spotted. A few days later, I learned that the man had been apprehended about 20 miles from where I had seen him. Authorities found a stash of stolen items from multiple backcountry campsites and several illegal firearms in his possession. I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering unease. For a week, every time I was alone on a trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, imagining what might have happened if I had confronted him directly. The whole experience left me with a new sense of respect for the solitude of the backcountry and the people who abuse it. I realized that being a park ranger isn't just about protecting nature. It's about protecting people from each other, too. That spring, every rustle in the trees, every shadow in the corner of my eye, reminded me that danger isn't always wild animals or falling trees. Sometimes it's human, and that truth stayed with me long after the case was closed. I've been a park ranger for over a decade, mostly in remote national forests where cell service is a luxury and the only sound for miles are the wind in the trees, birds, and the occasional snapping of twigs underfoot. Most days are quiet, almost peaceful, but there's always that underlying tension in the back of your mind, the sense that the forest is bigger and stranger than you are. You get used to it, but you never really stop noticing it. One of the scariest days of my career didn't involve bears, fires, or a rescue gone wrong. It involved something far more subtle, far more human, and far more unsettling. It started early on a crisp October morning. The sun was just rising, spilling thin streams of light through the dense canopy of the old-growth forest. I had been scheduled to patrol the northeast quadrant of the park, a part that most hikers avoided because the trails were narrow, steep, and prone to sudden washouts. I loaded my truck with the essentials: radio, first aid kit, extra water, and my rifle, though I hoped not to need it. The forest was already alive with movement. A pair of deer darted across a ridge, squirrels chattered in the trees, and the air smelled of damp leaves and pine resin. I parked at the trailhead for a remote Jeep track I sometimes used to cover the area faster. The road was barely more than a dirt path, rutted and slick from recent rain. I locked the truck and started walking, my boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. It was the kind of day where the forest feels infinite, where the path in front of you twists and disappears in shadows and mist. I was alone, but that's normal out here. Solitude is part of the job. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something unusual. Off the trail, about 20 feet into the trees, were tire tracks that didn't look old. They were fresh, deep, and wide, like a four-wheel drive vehicle had passed through recently. I frowned. This section of the park is mostly inaccessible to cars, and unauthorized vehicles were rare. Normally, I'd mark it and report it, but I decided to follow the tracks for a little while, curious but cautious. The deeper I went, the more I realized something was off. The forest, usually filled with the soft murmur of life, was quiet. Birds weren't singing, and the wind seemed to have died down. My boots crunched on fallen branches louder than usual. The tracks veered off the Jeep path and onto a smaller, nearly invisible game trail. My gut tightened. Whoever had been here had to be nearby. I kept moving slowly, scanning for movement, noting every sound. Then I saw it. A tarp stretched between two trees, camouflaged with leaves and branches, roughly 50 feet off the trail. My heart rate spiked. This was not a campsite, it was a hideout. I circled carefully, trying to see if there were signs of recent human presence. Smoke, fire pits, discarded supplies. A few cans, some torn clothing, and what looked like empty bottles lay scattered near the tarp. Whoever had been here wasn't a hiker. This was someone trying to stay hidden. I radioed my supervisor quietly, describing my location and what I had found. There was no immediate response other than the usual. Stay safe and don't engage unless necessary. I understood. I wasn't supposed to confront potentially dangerous people alone. Still, curiosity mixed with duty made me stay a little longer. Then I heard it, a snapping of a branch behind me. Light but deliberate. I froze. My instincts screamed to move slowly toward cover. I crouched behind a large fallen log, peering toward the sound. There, barely visible through the trees, was a man. He was wearing layers of mismatched clothing, dirty and torn, moving in a slow, cautious way as if he knew exactly where I was. He didn't call out, didn't signal, just kept moving toward the tarp. I realized he must have been watching me as much as I had been watching him. The situation hit me with cold clarity. I was alone in a remote part of the forest with a potentially dangerous stranger who had chosen this area for concealment. My pulse raced. I slowly backed toward the trail, staying low, making sure I had a clear path to my truck if needed. I kept my radio in hand, fingers ready on the transmit button. The man noticed me then, stepping out from behind a tree, but instead of charging, he froze and held up his hand slightly. There was no word, no smile, just a tense, hard stare. I didn't relax. I moved carefully, keeping my eyes on him, putting distance between us. He didn't follow immediately, just watched as I returned to the Jeep track. When I reached the truck, I locked the doors and radioed the dispatch again. This time, the response was immediate. Park rangers from nearby stations were en route. I stayed inside, engine running, heart pounding, waiting. By the time backup arrived, the man had vanished into the forest, leaving no trace beyond the tarp, the scattered supplies, and the tire tracks. The responding rangers searched for hours, combing the area, but there was nothing else. No footprints, no campfires, no sign of him. Only the unsettling feeling that someone had been there, watching, ready to react if I had made the wrong move. I filed my report in detail, noting every observation. For weeks afterward, the memory of that day lingered, not because of monsters or ghosts, but because of how quietly real danger can exist in places we assume are safe. The forest is big, wild, and mostly predictable, but occasionally it hides someone entirely unpredictable. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you know could be watching just out of sight. By the end of the day, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. I had survived without confrontation, without injury, and without a close call escalating into disaster. The patrol log was clear, the park's safer for hikers and campers. But every time I returned to that trail, I remembered the man in the trees and the absolute stillness that had settled over the forest. The ending was simple. I did my job, I stayed alive, and I learned to respect not just the wilderness, but the people who might hide within it. And that lesson, as unsettling as it was, stayed with me longer than any fear of bears, cliffs, or storms ever could. I had been working as a park ranger for over 6 years, mostly in the remote wilderness of the northern forests. People always think it's a quiet, peaceful job, full of hiking and beautiful scenery. It is for the most part, but there are moments that remind you just how unforgiving the wilderness can be. One of those moments happened in early October, when the days were getting shorter, the nights colder, and the forest seemed heavier with shadow. It was a late afternoon when I was doing a routine patrol on one of the back roads near the northern edge of the park. My truck rumbled along the dirt path, tires crunching over fallen pine needles and small stones. I had been called out to check on some reports of illegal camping in restricted areas, which wasn't unusual. Most of the time it was just a couple of teenagers, a small fire, maybe some trash, nothing serious. But this time, something fell off as soon as I turned onto the trail. The forest around me was dense, a mix of pines and firs, their needles thick on the ground. Sunlight was fading fast, streaking through the trees in long, golden lines. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the faint rustle of wind through the branches was the only sound except for the truck. I noticed that the trail ahead seemed unusually clear of leaves, almost as if someone had recently driven or walked there, though no tracks were visible. That struck me as odd, but not alarming yet. I parked the truck at a small clearing where the trail forked. From there, the main path continued deeper into the forest, but a smaller, narrower track veered off to the right. My gut told me to check it. Rangers get instincts about the woods. It's hard to explain, but it's like the forest communicates in subtle ways. I grabbed my flashlight, my jacket, and my sidearm, and started down the smaller trail. The ground underfoot was soft with layers of decaying leaves, and the smell of moss and wet bark filled the air. As I walked, the trail narrowed further, and I realized it hadn't been used in years. Branches brushed against my shoulders, and the undergrowth tugged at my boots. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels. Not even the wind seemed to penetrate this dense canopy. I slowed my pace, listening carefully. Then I heard it, a faint crunch like someone stepping on dry leaves somewhere up ahead. My first thought was another hiker, but there shouldn't be anyone out here. It was illegal to camp this deep in the park without a permit. I called out, but my voice barely carried. The forest seemed to absorb it, leaving only silence in return. The sound came again, closer this time, but not fast like someone running, slow, deliberate steps, almost careful. I raised my flashlight, swinging it from side to side, and caught a glimpse of something moving behind the trees. It was tall, hunched, and oddly stiff in its movements. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself to stay calm. Rangers get nervous sometimes in the woods, but this felt different. I continued down the path, keeping the beam on my flashlight trained ahead. Then I noticed signs, trampled vegetation, a broken branch here, a bent sapling there. Someone or something was definitely moving through these woods. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but there was no signal. In these remote areas, sometimes even the satellite connection is patchy. My only choice was to continue on foot and hope the trail eventually led to the main road. The path curved sharply, leading to a small clearing. My flashlight caught a movement at the far end, and I froze. It was a man, thin, wearing a dark jacket, hunched over a backpack that looked full. He was digging at the edge of a shallow hole in the ground, methodical, as if burying something. For a moment, he didn't notice me. I stepped closer, my boots crunching, and he finally turned. His face was pale, gaunt, and streaked with dirt. The expression in his eyes made my stomach drop. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Something empty, and yet purposeful. I knew I had to act fast. I stepped forward, shouting that I was a ranger, demanding he stop. He didn't flinch at first, just stared, and then bolted into the woods with a speed that seemed unnatural. I chased him for a few minutes, but the darkness and thick underbrush made it impossible to follow. By the time I returned to the clearing, the hole was empty, but the ground around it was freshly disturbed. A faint metallic glint caught my flashlight beam, a small, rusted canister half buried in the dirt. I picked it up carefully and checked inside. It was empty, but there were signs that it had held something important, maybe something illegal. By the time I made it back to my truck, the sun had completely set, and the forest was a wall of black. I radioed in what I had found and waited for backup to arrive. The investigation later revealed that the man had been illegally dumping stolen chemicals used for poaching operations, explaining the clandestine behavior. They eventually tracked him down using surveillance cameras near the park entrance. But until that moment, walking through those dark, empty woods alone and realizing that someone was deliberately hiding something, it was one of the most chilling experiences I've had. After that day, I made a rule to trust my instincts even more and to never assume the woods are ever entirely empty. The forest is quiet, yes, but it's also full of secrets, and sometimes those secrets move faster and quieter than you ever expect. The clearing where I found the hole still gives me pause whenever I patrol near it. I've walked past it dozens of times since, but I always make sure to keep my flashlight steady, my senses alert, and my hand close to my sidearm. The woods don't forgive mistakes, and they certainly don't forgive underestimating the people who think they can use them as cover. I had been a park ranger for almost 7 years by the time that day happened, working in one of the more remote sections of the national forest. The forest itself wasn't famous, at least not to the general public, but to someone like me, it was a vast expanse of old-growth trees, thick underbrush, and winding, poorly maintained logging roads that crisscrossed valleys and hills. My routine was usually uneventful. Patrols in the morning, checking trails, making sure people weren't doing anything illegal, responding to minor injuries, and keeping wildlife reports. It was peaceful, predictable, and most importantly, safe. At least, that's what I thought until the day I encountered something that reminded me just how unpredictable nature could be. It started on a late October morning. The fog was hanging low, heavy and gray, a kind that sinks into the valleys and creeps through the trees. I was scheduled for a solo patrol, driving my old, beat-up Ranger truck down one of the forest's lesser-used roads. My goal was to reach a small lake tucked deep in the north section, a place that was perfect for a short hike and usually untouched by anyone but occasional hunters and hikers. I had my usual gear, a radio, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a sturdy knife strapped to my belt, and my old rifle in the truck just in case. The day was quiet, eerily quiet, but at first I thought nothing of it. Birds chirped sporadically, the wind rustled through the trees, and the faint scent of wet leaves filled the air. The road to the lake was narrow, overgrown in places, with roots and fallen branches making it tricky to navigate even in a truck. I had to drive slowly, keeping my eyes sharp for any movement. About an hour into my drive, I noticed something unusual, a series of deep tire tracks veering off the road and into a small clearing. The tracks were fresh, the mud still soft and slightly shiny, indicating that someone had passed through very recently. I parked a little way down the road and got out to inspect. The clearing was small, no more than 50 feet across, surrounded by tall pine trees. I followed the tracks a short distance into the trees and realized they led to a small, makeshift campsite. It wasn't legal, but that wasn't what caught my attention. The campsite looked abandoned. The fire pit had cold ashes, a small tent was collapsed at the edge of the clearing, and there were signs of someone having left in a hurry. A backpack half open with supplies scattered, a pair of muddy boots tipped over near the edge of the tree lane. My gut tightened. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just that someone had left in a hurry. It was how quiet it was. There were no birds now, no wind through the treetops, nothing except the soft, unsettling crunch of my boots on the forest floor as I stepped closer. Then I noticed the scratches on the trees near the tent. There were deep, vertical gouges, rough and erratic, like someone had been trying to climb or escape. And nearby, partially hidden under leaves, were footprints, not human. Large, wide, and heavy. My training told me it could be a bear, but bears don't usually make that kind of mess in a campsite or leave tracks that looked almost like oversized human feet. I took out my radio and tried to call headquarters, but there was nothing. Just static. My phone had no signal either. I had a sense of isolation I had never felt in all my years in the forest. I decided to backtrack to the truck, hoping to radio in once I reached the road. That's when I heard it, a faint, low grunt coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. I froze. My mind ran through every possibility: wounded animal, another person hiding, maybe a lost hiker. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, measured, not the random noises you usually hear in the forest. I gripped my knife, but instinctively, I reached for the rifle in my truck. Slowly, carefully, I backed toward the road, trying not to make any noise. The next hour was a nightmare. Every step I took, the grunting followed, echoing through the fog. I could see glimpses of movement, shadows slipping between the trees, but nothing clear. At one point, I stumbled into a shallow creek, wetting my boots, and the sound of water seemed to anger whatever was following me. The grunting got louder, faster. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. Then suddenly silence. I froze, listening. Nothing. I slowly raised my head and saw the faint outline of a figure, hunched, standing about 30 feet away in the fog. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew if I ran blindly, I could trip or get lost. I raised my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. It was massive, easily over 6 feet, broad-shouldered. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was human, but the way it stood, the unnatural stiffness, made my stomach turn. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving faster than anything human should move. I ran back to my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove, slowly, constantly scanning the tree line, until I finally reached the main road. The radio crackled to life then, and I called to my location, explaining the abandoned campsite, the tracks, the grunting, and the figure. Backup arrived within an hour, and we searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything, just the abandoned campsite, now eerily silent in the daylight. It took days for my adrenaline to settle. I returned to that section of the forest several times after, but the fog was never as thick, the forest never as quiet. Whatever I saw that day, I never encountered it again, but it reminded me how unpredictable the wilderness can be. It reminded me that even as a trained ranger, prepared for emergencies, the forest has its own rules, and sometimes we're simply intruders, not in control. That day changed how I approach my patrols. I learned to respect the forest even more, to move cautiously, and to always trust the feeling in the pit of my stomach. Nature can be quiet, beautiful, and deadly all at once, and sometimes it's the silence that tells you the most. Back in 2010, I set out on a solo bike camping trip through the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. I had a general route in mind, a backroads trip from Portland to Seattle using the Baby Shoe Pass route. I love the idea of exploring on 2 wheels, alone, carrying just enough gear to survive, but not so much that I would feel weighed down. The thrill of being completely self-sufficient in the middle of the forest was what drew me to these trips. I had done solo camping before, but this was different. I was going deep, looking for trails that barely appeared on maps, wanted to test my own instincts and endurance. One afternoon, I found myself near Big Tire Junction, scanning the forest edge for a trail that might lead to a decent campsite. My plan was always the same: pick a jeep trail, follow it until it felt right, and then stop. It usually worked. I had my gear packed lightly: a sleeping bag, a small stove, a couple of days of food, and my bike, of course. The weather was crisp but not cold, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth, a mix that felt familiar and comforting. The first trail I tried turned out to be more dangerous than I expected. I had barely pedaled a quarter mile when I ran into a bear. It wasn't a huge bear, but it was close enough that I could see the dark eyes watching me, the slight twitch of its ears, the slow, deliberate movement toward me. My heart jumped, and I realized my bike bell was my only defense. I rang it over and over, making as much noise as possible. The bear hesitated, sniffing the air, and then slowly backed off, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned around and pedaled back to the main trail, my heart still racing, feeling a mix of relief and awe. Encounters like that reminded me why I respected these woods so much. I eventually found another trail, a less obvious one, partially overgrown, twisting and narrow. It felt right. I followed it, the crunch of dirt and gravel under my tires, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. About 50 miles from the nearest human habitation, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for the night. It was quiet, shielded from the wind, and just wide enough for me to stretch out. I had no tent, so I would be sleeping in my bag, which wasn't ideal because the mosquitoes were merciless. At around 4,200 feet, they were relentless, swarming in clouds, biting through clothing if I wasn't careful. By 8:30, I had crawled into my sleeping bag, hoping for some respite, the itch of mosquito bites gnawing at me as I tried to calm down and rest. 20 minutes into trying to sleep, I heard an engine. The sound cut through the forest in a way that made my chest tighten. I peeked out of my bag and saw a truck driving down the trail. The headlights washed over the trees, and for a moment I locked eyes with the driver. He passed my camp, disappearing down the trail, and I felt a cold wave of unease. I pulled out my map, confirming that this trail didn't go anywhere for miles and ended after descending into a canyon. I thought about how far I was from any town, any road, any other human. The realization hit me. There were only two people on Earth who knew exactly where I was, me and that guy in the truck. The thought alone made my stomach twist. 30 minutes later, he came back, driving past me again, then vanished into the darkness. I stayed put, too uncertain to make any move, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the occasional distant sound of wildlife. I finally managed a restless sleep, haunted by the memory of the bear and the unknown truck driver. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't shake off, as if it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I moved on, eventually finding an abandoned campground near Talklock Lake. The place was quiet, the remnants of old picnic tables and fire pits half swallowed by moss and undergrowth. I set up in a corner, hidden behind a massive berm placed by the Forest Service, hoping for a night without incident. But that night, some yahoos arrived. They were loud, drunk, and armed, shooting into the air for no reason I could discern. I froze in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, counting the seconds until they moved on. It was clear they had no idea I was there, and I was grateful for the berm and the shadows. I slipped out at 5 a.m., moving quietly to avoid any confrontation. The forest was peaceful in the early morning light, the haze lifting off the lake, the scent of wet pine needles filling the air. I rode out, feeling the tension leave my body with each pedal stroke, the previous night's fear giving way to relief. I spent the rest of the trip moving through the forest, taking in the quiet moments, the endless expanse of green, and the sense of absolute isolation that only comes from being miles from anyone else. When I finally returned to civilization, I realized the trip had changed me in a subtle way. The fear, the quiet, the beauty, and the danger had all combined into something unforgettable. I missed those days, the sense of freedom, the unknown, the feeling that the world was both vast and intimate at the same time. Even though I would eventually return to city life, with its noise and routine, a part of me would always be out there, pedaling down a narrow forest trail, alone, alive, and acutely aware of every sound, every shadow, every heartbeat. I had been a park ranger in the Northern Rockies for just over 3 years, and by that time, I had grown used to the kind of quiet that stretches over the forest at night. People think of forest as peaceful, But I've learned the truth. It's a living thing, and it can be downright dangerous. I had seen bears, mountain lions, and people who had wandered off trails and gotten lost, sometimes for days. Nothing, though, had prepared me for what I encountered that late September night. I was on a routine solo patrol in the backcountry of the park, far from the main roads. I liked to ride my ATV along the old logging tracks to check on the trailheads and campsites. That day had been unusually warm for the season, and the smell of wet pine mixed with the earthy scent of fallen leaves was thick in the air. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows through the dense forest. I always liked the hour before sunset. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I had just turned off the main gravel road onto a narrower, overgrown trail that led toward a small, forgotten campsite near a creek. I had been following the trail for about 20 minutes when my ATV sputtered slightly, the engine coughing before settling back into a low growl. I slowed down, checking the fuel gauge. Full tank. Strange. I shrugged it off and pressed on. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were tall and thick, and the trail was covered in fallen branches and wet leaves. I could hear the faint rush of water from the creek nearby, but there was something else, a quiet rustling, just beyond the edge of the trail. I stopped and listened. Nothing. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind. I reached the small clearing where the campsite should have been. It was abandoned, the fire pit cold, no trash or signs of recent visitors. That wasn't unusual for this remote spot, but as I turned my ATV around to head back, I noticed something odd. The dirt trail ahead looked freshly disturbed. Tire tracks, small ones, like from a dirt bike, cut across the path, but they weren't recent enough to be obvious. The tracks veered off the trail and into the trees. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow them on foot. I parked my ATV and took my flashlight from the pack. The light cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees and the moss-covered ground. The tracks were faint but clear. They twisted through the underbrush and eventually led to a narrow ridge overlooking a ravine. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched near the edge, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a hiker or maybe a hunter, someone who had wandered off. But as I watched, the figure moved in a way that was unnatural, jerky, almost mechanical. I felt a chill run down my spine. My training told me to keep calm, assess, and retreat if necessary. I stayed where I was, shining the flashlight intermittently to get a better look. The figure disappeared for a moment behind a tree, and when it reappeared, it was holding something. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but then I realized it was a rifle pointed in the direction of the creek below. My heart started pounding. Hunters were not unusual, but this person wasn't wearing any bright clothing or hunter's orange, and the way they moved felt wrong, silent, deliberate, almost predatory. I backed away slowly, trying to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. That's when I noticed something else. The ground around the figure was littered with what looked like old camping gear, tarps, and containers. This wasn't just a hiker or hunter. Someone had been living here, hidden in the backcountry, completely off the map. The thought hit me like a punch. This person was intentionally avoiding the main trails, possibly for months. I turned to head back to my ATV, but as I did, I heard the snap of a branch behind me. I froze. There was no trail there, nothing visible, but the sound came from the underbrush directly to my right. I grabbed my radio and clicked it, hoping to reach base. Base, this is Ranger Holt. I'm near, static. No signal. The forest swallowed the sound. Adrenaline kicked in. I ran. Branches whipped at my face. Roots tried to trip me, and every shadow seemed alive. When I finally reached my ATV, I didn't even try to start it immediately. I jumped on, the engine roaring as I tore down the trail. The forest blurred past me. Behind me, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but I didn't look back. Not until I was safely back on the main road. I reported the sight the next morning. A team went in to check it, and what they found confirmed my worst fears. Hidden along the ridge were makeshift shelters, a large stockpile of food and supplies, and evidence that someone had been living off the grid for months. No one was there when they arrived, But it was clear this wasn't just a transient camper. The person had vanished, leaving behind only the silent reminder that the backcountry can hide anyone, and they can watch without ever being seen. After that, I took a different route for my patrols, sticking closer to the main trails. I never saw the person again, and the site was eventually dismantled by law enforcement, but the memory stayed with me. I realized that the scariest part wasn't the figure itself. It was the knowledge that someone could live in the forest, unnoticed, patient, and unseen. The forest had given them cover, and in that quiet darkness, I understood just how vulnerable we really are when we think we're alone in the wild. I was working a late season shift as a park ranger in the northern section of a national forest, the kind of area most visitors avoid once the days start getting shorter. The forest was dense, with towering pines and old-growth firs that blocked most of the late afternoon light. By the time I finished checking the last trailhead of the day, shadows were already crawling across the dirt roads, making everything feel smaller and more claustrophobic. My routine was simple. Check for illegal campers, make sure all trail signs were in place, and keep an eye out for any wildlife issues. Nothing ever happened that wasn't part of the usual grind. Or at least, that's what I thought. I had been driving slowly down an old logging road, the kind that had been abandoned years ago and only used by the Forest Service for maintenance. The road narrowed quickly, flanked on either side by steep drops into the river valleys below. Fallen leaves covered the edges, hiding old ruts and rocks, and I had to keep my speed low to avoid bottoming out my truck. The wind had picked up by this point, whistling through the trees and rattling the loose branches. The sound made the forest feel alive, like it was breathing around me. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, a nagging sense that I wasn't supposed to be alone out here, even though I had done this route dozens of times before. I reached a small clearing where the road forked. One path led to a well-known campsite near a creek. The other twisted into a darker section of the forest that few people ever bothered to explore. Normally, I would take the first path, but that day, I felt compelled to check the other. I don't know why. I think part of it was curiosity, part of it was just wanting to get the drive over with before night fully settled. The forest on this road was denser, the trees closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled. It was quieter here, almost unnervingly so. Even the wind didn't seem to move the upper branches as much. As I drove, I noticed tire tracks that weren't mine, fresh, deep tracks that suggested a truck or SUV had passed through not long ago. The tracks were uneven, like the driver had been struggling to stay on the road, and they led deeper into the forest. At first, I thought maybe some campers had gone in without permits, but then I remembered the forest regulations. Off-road driving was illegal here, and the area I was looking at was especially protected. I made a mental note to check it more carefully and drove a bit further to see where the tracks went. The road became rougher, with rocks jutting up through the soil and large roots breaking the surface. My truck bounced hard over each obstacle, and I could feel the tires slipping on loose dirt and leaves. The further I went, the darker it became. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, and shadows stretched across the road like fingers reaching out for me. I started to hear sounds that didn't belong, snaps of branches that couldn't have been from my truck, a scraping sound on the gravel, like metal on stone. My stomach tightened. I'm a park ranger. I see bears and mountain lions all the time, and I can handle most wildlife encounters. But there is something different about this feeling, something human, deliberate. I pulled over and got out of the truck, flashlight in hand. The air was cold, heavy with the smell of wet pine needles and moss. I checked the tire tracks again. They ended abruptly near a large fallen log that blocked the path completely. That alone was unusual. Someone who was off-roading would have either moved the log or gone around it. I circled the area, shining my light into the trees. Nothing moved, but the tracks continued faintly on the other side of the log, disappearing into the thick brush. My gut told me to leave, but another part of me, a professional instinct, wanted to see what had caused it. I carefully climbed over the log and followed the trail. The underbrush was thick, snagging in my pants and scratching my arms. The light from my flashlight barely reached more than 10 feet in front of me. That's when I noticed it, a small campsite, hastily made. The fire pit was cold, but freshly built. Someone had left their gear scattered. Tarps, some food containers, a flashlight, and a backpack zipped shut. Everything was there, but there was no one. No footprints leaving in any direction, just a trail I had been following. My heart started to pound. I called out just to hear my voice, but it faded into the trees. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the shadows. Then I noticed something else, scratches on the trees, vertical marks that weren't natural. They were deep, claw-like, but clearly made by human hands. It was a warning, not accidental, and my stomach sank. Whoever had been here wasn't camping for fun. They were hiding, watching, waiting. My rational mind tried to convince me to leave, but my training kept me thinking in steps. Mark the location, radio in the situation, backtrack slowly. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed forward, and returned to the truck. My hands shook as I started the engine. I drove out carefully, making sure to watch the trees for movement. When I finally hit the main dirt road, I radioed in the location and the situation. Backup was coming, and we cleared the area the next day. Law enforcement found the campsite abandoned again, but with evidence that someone had been living there illegally for weeks, possibly months. They suspected poaching and trespassing, maybe even something worse, but nothing violent had occurred. The forest, however, had felt dangerous, and I couldn't shake the memory of those marks on the trees. From that day on, I never went off that route alone. I stuck to the main roads, the clearings, the areas I knew were safe. Even as a park ranger, I realized the forest had boundaries I wasn't meant to cross, and the people who ignored them were more dangerous than anything I had trained to handle. The experience stayed with me, not because it was supernatural or because I saw a monster, but because it reminded me how small and vulnerable a single human can feel in the woods, surrounded by someone else who knows it better than you do. That feeling, more than anything, is what kept me cautious for the rest of my career.